The systematic examination of skeletal remains recovered from a Romano-British cemetery site near Gloucester during excavations conducted between 1996 and 2001 revealed something that would fundamentally challenge conventional understanding of ancient population movements in Britain. Isotopic analysis of tooth enamel from individuals buried in what appeared to be a typical provincial Roman town demonstrated that nearly 40% of the interred population had originated from regions far beyond the British Isles, including territories in North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and various provinces across the Roman Empire. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper, let's dive in. The archaeological evidence predating Roman occupation reveals patterns of population movement across the Channel, separating Britain from continental Europe, that extended back into periods where written documentation does not exist, forcing scholars to rely entirely on material culture, genetic analysis, and linguistic reconstruction to understand the composition and origins of pre-Roman British populations. The Beaker culture, which appeared in Britain around 2,600 years before the Common Era, represented one of the earliest archaeologically visible migration events that fundamentally altered the genetic and cultural landscape of the islands. The period between the Beaker migration and the Roman conquest, spanning roughly 2 millennia, witnessed continuous population movements between Britain and the continental mainland, though the scale and character of these migrations remain subjects of scholarly debate due to the absence of written records and the difficulty of distinguishing between the movement of people and the movement of cultural practices through trade and social contact. The Celtic languages that dominated Britain by the time of Roman contact had clearly spread from continental Europe, but whether this linguistic transformation resulted from mass migration, elite dominance by small groups of Celtic-speaking warriors and traders, or gradual cultural diffusion through economic and social networks, remains contested among linguists and archaeologists. The Roman conquest of Britain, beginning with Claudius's invasion in 43 of the Common Era and extending over the subsequent 4 decades, as Roman forces gradually subdued tribal resistances and extended imperial control northward to the eventual frontier at Hadrian's Wall, initiated the first sustained period of documented immigration into Britain under systematic administrative oversight. The Roman military presence required the movement of substantial numbers of soldiers recruited from across the empire, creating garrison communities in newly established forts and towns that included not only legionaries from Italy, but auxiliary troops drawn from Germanic territories, North Africa, the Balkans, Syria, and virtually every other corner of Roman domains. The civilian immigration that accompanied military occupation encompassed merchants, craftsmen, administrators, and families who followed commercial opportunities and administrative positions created by Roman imperial expansion. The establishment of Londinium as the provincial capital and primary commercial centre attracted traders from across the Mediterranean world, who established permanent operations to facilitate the exchange of British resources, particularly tin, lead, and agricultural products, for manufactured goods, wine, olive oil, and luxury items produced in other provinces. Evidence recovered from excavations in Roman London includes North African pottery, Syrian glassware, and inscriptions in Greek and Aramaic that testify to the cosmopolitan character of the city's commercial community. The scale of immigration during the Roman period becomes apparent through systematic analysis of skeletal remains, funerary inscriptions, and documentary sources that collectively reveal a population far more diverse than traditional narratives of Romano-British society had suggested. The cemetery excavations at York, site of the Roman fortress of Eboracum that served as the provincial capital of Britannia Inferior during the later empire, uncovered individuals whose skeletal chemistry indicated origins in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, in proportions that suggested these were not isolated cases, but representative of broader demographic patterns. The economic systems that developed during Roman rule created structural incentives for immigration, that sustained population movements even after the initial conquest period, as the integration of Britain into the empire's trade networks generated opportunities for merchants, craftsmen, and labourers whose skills and connections enabled them to profit from the province's resources and markets. The exploitation of British mineral resources, particularly the lead and silver deposits of the Mendip Hills and the tin mines of Cornwall, required technical expertise and capital investment that often came from immigrant entrepreneurs who possessed knowledge of mining techniques and access to networks of refiners and merchants in other provinces. The religious transformations that occurred during the later Roman period, particularly the gradual spread of Christianity and the suppression of traditional pagan practices, created new patterns of migration as religious personnel moved between provinces to establish ecclesiastical structures and propagate the faith. The establishment of Christian communities in Britain during the 3rd and 4th centuries brought priests, monks, and religious teachers from Gaul, Italy, and other regions where Christianity had already achieved significant institutional development. The participation of British bishops in the Council of Arles in 314 demonstrates the integration of British Christian communities into the broader ecclesiastical networks of the empire, while archaeological evidence of Christian symbols, churches, and burial practices reveals the spread of the new religion across both urban and rural areas. The movement of religious personnel intensified during the 4th century as imperial policies increasingly favoured Christianity, and as persecution of paganism drove some practitioners of traditional religions into frontier regions where enforcement of anti-pagan legislation was less rigorous. The intellectual and theological debates that characterized early Christianity generated exchanges of correspondence, visits by prominent religious figures, and the movement of scholars between provinces that contributed to the circulation of ideas and the development of religious institutions. The British monk Pelagius, whose theological views on free will and divine grace generated controversy throughout the late 4th and early 5th centuries, exemplifies the international character of Christian intellectual life and the movement of British religious figures into broader Mediterranean networks, though his case represents emigration from Britain rather than immigration into it. The collapse of Roman imperial authority in Britain during the early 5th century, traditionally dated to 410, when the Emperor Honorius instructed British cities to arrange for their own defence, created political and economic disruptions that fundamentally altered the patterns of population movement that had characterized the preceding 4 centuries of Roman rule. The withdrawal of Roman military forces from Britain, a process that had begun decades earlier as the empire concentrated its resources on defending more strategically crucial provinces against escalating barbarian pressures, removed the institutional structures that had facilitated and regulated immigration during the Roman period. The breakdown of long-distance trade networks as Roman economic systems disintegrated reduced the incentives for merchant immigration, while the fragmentation of political authority into competing British kingdoms eliminated the centralized administrative apparatus that had managed population movements. The material culture of 5th century Britain reveals a dramatic decline in the production and use of Roman-style manufactured goods, the abandonment of urban centres, and the collapse of monetary exchange systems that collectively suggest a fundamental transformation of economic and social organisation. This transformation occurred alongside, and was partly caused by, the beginning of migrations from continental Europe that would ultimately result in the creation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that dominated England until the Norman conquest 6 centuries later. The Anglo-Saxon migrations represent the most significant population movement in British history, fundamentally transforming the demographic, linguistic, and cultural character of the territories that would become England. The traditional narrative of Anglo-Saxon settlement derived largely from the Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people, written in 731, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in the late 9th century, described the arrival of Germanic peoples from the regions of modern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands as a rapid conquest that displaced or subjugated the Romano-British population. Bede's account, written 3 centuries after the events he described, and relying on oral traditions and earlier written sources now lost, attributed the Anglo-Saxon settlement to the invitation of British leaders who recruited Germanic warriors as mercenaries to defend against Pictish and Scottish raids following the collapse of Roman authority. According to this narrative, the invited Germanic warriors subsequently rebelled against their British hosts, summoning reinforcements from their continental homelands and establishing the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms through military conquest. The archaeological evidence accumulated through centuries of excavation and the genetic analysis of skeletal remains conducted using modern DNA sequencing technologies have complicated and nuanced this traditional narrative, revealing a migration process that extended over several centuries, involved populations of substantial size, and resulted in varying degrees of population replacement and cultural transformation across different regions. The initial phases of Anglo-Saxon immigration, occurring during the 5th century, appear to have involved relatively small groups of warriors and their dependents who established settlements in eastern and southern Britain, particularly in regions corresponding to modern Kent, Sussex, East Anglia, and the Thames Valley. Archaeological evidence from this period includes the appearance of distinctive Anglo-Saxon material culture, particularly pottery, metalwork, and burial practices that differ markedly from Romano-British traditions and closely resemble artifacts and practices documented in continental Germanic regions. The cremation cemeteries that appeared in eastern Britain during the mid-5th century contained urns with decorative motifs and forms identical to those found in Saxony and Schleswig-Holstein, suggesting the direct movement of people from these continental regions rather than merely the adoption of foreign cultural practices by indigenous populations. The presence of weapon burials, including high-status interments with elaborate swords, shields, and spears, indicates the migration of warrior elites whose military capabilities enabled them to establish political dominance in regions where Romano-British authority had collapsed or fragmented. The linguistic evidence, though difficult to interpret due to the absence of written sources from this period, suggests that Germanic languages began displacing British Celtic dialects in eastern regions during the 5th century, a linguistic transformation that would eventually extend across most of the territory south of Hadrian's Wall. The acceleration of Anglo-Saxon immigration during the 6th century resulted in the establishment of recognizable kingdoms that would form the political structure of early medieval England. The Kingdom of Kent, traditionally founded by Hengist and Horsa according to legendary accounts preserved in later chronicles, emerged as a distinct political entity with close cultural and commercial connections to Frankish territories across the Channel. The East Anglian Kingdom, whose royal burial complex at Sutton Hoo reveals extraordinary wealth and international connections through the mid-7th century, developed in territories that had been only lightly Romanized, and where Anglo-Saxon settlement appears to have resulted in substantial population replacement. The expansion of Anglo-Saxon settlement westward and northward during the 6th century brought Germanic populations into regions that had maintained Romano-British political and cultural traditions, generating conflicts documented in British sources, like the writings attributed to Gildas and later Welsh chronicles, that described resistance to Saxon encroachment. The British victory at Mount Badon, traditionally dated to around 500 and mentioned by Gildas as a significant check on Saxon expansion, temporarily halted the westward spread of Anglo-Saxon settlement, but could not prevent the eventual establishment of Anglo-Saxon dominance across most of lowland Britain. The Kingdom of Wessex, emerging from Saxon settlements in the Thames Valley and Hampshire during the 6th century, would eventually become the most powerful Anglo-Saxon realm and the nucleus around which English political unity would coalesce in the 10th century. The question of how Anglo-Saxon migration affected the Romano-British population remains among the most contested issues in early medieval British history, with interpretations ranging from scenarios of population replacement through violence and displacement to models emphasizing cultural assimilation and elite dominance, where relatively small numbers of Germanic immigrants impose their language and culture on much larger indigenous populations. The genetic evidence, derived from DNA analysis of skeletal remains from both pre-migration Romano-British contexts and later Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, suggests significant population continuity in some regions, alongside substantial Germanic immigration in others, creating a complex demographic picture that varies considerably across different territories. In eastern Britain, genetic markers associated with North Germanic populations appear in high frequencies that suggest major population replacement, while in western regions the genetic continuity with Romano-British populations is much more pronounced. The linguistic evidence, particularly the almost complete replacement of British Celtic place names with Anglo-Saxon toponyms in eastern and central England, has traditionally been interpreted as evidence for population displacement, though some scholars argue that linguistic replacement could occur through elite dominance and the social prestige associated with Germanic identity, without requiring the physical displacement of indigenous populations. The absence of significant Celtic influence on Old English grammar and vocabulary, unlike the situation in other regions of Germanic expansion, where substrate languages left clear marks on the conquering language, suggests either that the Celtic-speaking population was too thoroughly dominated to influence the language of their conquerors, or that population replacement was sufficiently extensive to minimize such linguistic contact. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity during the 7th century initiated new patterns of immigration, as missionaries, monks, and religious personnel moved between Britain and the continent, establishing ecclesiastical institutions and creating networks of religious and cultural exchange. The Gregorian mission, dispatched by Pope Gregory the Great in 596 under the leadership of Augustine, represented the first systematic attempt to Christianize the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms through papal authority. Augustine's arrival in Kent in 597 and his subsequent establishment of the See of Canterbury as the ecclesiastical centre of English Christianity brought not only Italian missionaries, but also Frankish priests and monks who had accompanied the mission. The creation of monasteries and episcopal sees required the recruitment of additional religious personnel from the continent, as the newly converted Anglo-Saxon kingdoms initially lacked sufficient numbers of trained clergy to staff the expanding ecclesiastical infrastructure. The monastery at Canterbury developed as a centre of learning that attracted scholars and religious teachers from Italy, Gaul, and later Ireland, creating a cosmopolitan religious community that synthesized Roman, Frankish, and Celtic Christian traditions. The parallel mission from Ireland, led by figures like Aidan, who established the monastery at Lindisfarne in 635, brought Irish monks whose distinctive practices and theological emphases sometimes conflicted with Roman traditions, generating ecclesiastical controversies that would be resolved at the Synod of Whitby in 664 in favour of Roman practices. The intellectual and artistic flowering of Anglo-Saxon England during the 7th and 8th centuries, often characterised as the Northumbrian Renaissance, owed much to the immigration of scholars and craftsmen who brought learning and skills from continental and Mediterranean sources. The arrival of Theodore of Tarsus, a Greek monk from Cilicia, appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury in 668, brought someone with direct knowledge of Greek philosophy and Eastern Christian theological traditions to the highest ecclesiastical office in England. Theodore's companion, Hadrian, an African monk who became abbot of the monastery at Canterbury, similarly represented the international recruitment of learned personnel, whose expertise could elevate the intellectual standards of English ecclesiastical institutions. The school established at Canterbury under Theodore and Hadrian's direction achieved such distinction that students from across Anglo-Saxon England and even from the continent travelled to study there, learning Latin, Greek, biblical exegesis, and various scientific disciplines. The cultural exchanges facilitated by these immigrant scholars contributed to the achievements of figures like Bede, whose historical and theological works synthesized continental learning with indigenous Anglo-Saxon traditions, and Benedict Biscop, who made multiple journeys to Rome and returned with books, relics, and craftsmen who helped establish monasteries at Wearmouth and Jarrow that became centres of learning and manuscript production. The Viking raids that began with the attack on Lindisfarne in 793 initiated a new phase of Scandinavian interaction with England that would evolve from sporadic coastal raids to large-scale immigration and permanent settlement. The initial Viking attacks targeted wealthy monasteries and coastal settlements, where raiders could strike quickly and withdraw with plunder before local defences could organise effective resistance. The escalation of Viking activity during the early 9th century brought larger forces that remained in England for extended periods, establishing bases from which they could launch attacks deeper into Anglo-Saxon territories. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 marked the transition from raiding to conquest and settlement, as Danish forces systematically conquered East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia, establishing political control over territories that would collectively become known as the Danelaw. The archaeological evidence of Scandinavian settlement, including distinctive burial practices, changes in material culture, and the appearance of Scandinavian-style artifacts in domestic contexts, demonstrates that military conquest was accompanied by substantial civilian immigration as Scandinavian farmers, craftsmen, and merchants established permanent communities in the conquered territories. The scale of Scandinavian settlement in the Danelaw becomes apparent through analysis of place names, linguistic evidence, and genetic studies that collectively suggest immigration of significant proportions. The density of Scandinavian place names in regions of modern Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, and East Anglia, including not only settlements with characteristically Scandinavian names, but also hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian place names that suggest interaction between immigrant and indigenous populations, indicates settlement that penetrated deeply into the countryside, rather than remaining confined to military garrison towns. The linguistic evidence includes the adoption of numerous Scandinavian words into English, particularly basic vocabulary related to everyday activities and social relationships that suggest extensive contact and probably intermarriage between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations. The genetic evidence, though complicated by the close relationship between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations who shared common North Germanic ancestry, shows increased frequencies of genetic markers associated with Scandinavian populations in regions corresponding to the historical Danelaw. The isotopic analysis of skeletal remains from Viking Age cemeteries reveals individuals who had grown up in Scandinavia and migrated to England as adults, alongside individuals with mixed isotopic signatures, suggesting childhood in England and time spent in Scandinavia, indicating patterns of circular migration and maintained connections between Scandinavian settlers and their homelands. The political organization of the Danelaw under Scandinavian rulers created distinct administrative and legal structures that reflected the immigrants' cultural traditions while adapting to the governance needs of agricultural territories. The division of the Danelaw into administrative units based on Scandinavian models, the application of Scandinavian legal customs documented in later legal codes, and the establishment of towns as commercial and administrative centres under Scandinavian names all demonstrate the extent to which immigration transformed the political landscape of conquered regions. The town of York, captured by the Great Heathen Army in 866, developed under Scandinavian rule into Jorvik, a major commercial centre with extensive trade connections to Scandinavia, Ireland, and the Baltic region. Archaeological excavations at York have uncovered evidence of specialised craft production, particularly metalworking and textile manufacturing, alongside imported goods from across the Viking world that demonstrate the economic vitality of this Scandinavian-ruled town. The 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, comprising Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford, functioned as military and administrative centres where Scandinavian armies had based themselves and around which civilian settlements developed. The archaeological and documentary evidence suggests these towns attracted not only Scandinavian immigrants, but also Anglo-Saxon populations seeking the economic opportunities created by urban commercial growth, generating mixed communities where cultural boundaries gradually blurred through intermarriage and economic cooperation. The Scandinavian immigration to England during the 9th and 10th centuries included not only Danes, but also Norwegians, who established settlements in northwestern regions and maintained connections with Norwegian colonies in Ireland, the Scottish Islands. The Norwegian presence in Cumbria and Lancashire, documented through place name evidence, and archaeological findings reflected the movement of Scandinavian populations who had first settled in Ireland before crossing to northwestern England, often bringing Irish cultural influences alongside their Norwegian heritage. The Kingdom of Dublin, established by Norwegian Vikings in the mid-9th century, served as a base for expansion into northwestern England and maintained close political and economic connections with Scandinavian settlements in Cumbria and along the Lancashire coast. The circulation of Irish Scandinavian artifacts in northwestern England, including distinctive jewellery styles and metalworking techniques, demonstrates the cultural complexity of Viking Age migration, where immigrants brought not only their Scandinavian heritage, but also cultural elements acquired during intermediate settlement in other regions. The linguistic evidence includes Norwegian influence on local dialects, alongside Danish elements in the Eastern Danelaw, creating regional variations in Scandinavian linguistic impact that reflected the different origins of immigrant populations across different territories. The reconquest of the Danelaw by the West Saxon dynasty during the 10th century, beginning with Edward the Elder's campaigns in the 900s and 10s, and culminating in the incorporation of the last independent Scandinavian territories under English rule by 954, did not end Scandinavian immigration, but rather channeled it through different mechanisms as Scandinavian populations continued arriving and integrating into a politically unified English kingdom. The establishment of English royal authority over formerly independent Scandinavian territories required administrative arrangements that accommodated the Scandinavian population while asserting English sovereignty, typically through the preservation of local legal customs and the retention or appointment of local leaders willing to accept English overlordship. The continued immigration of Scandinavians during the later 10th century, though less well documented than the military migrations of the 9th century, appears in references to Scandinavian merchants, craftsmen, and mercenaries who found opportunities in a unified English kingdom that maintained strong commercial and political connections with Scandinavia. The archaeological evidence from urban centres like London, which had resisted Scandinavian conquest, but developed substantial Scandinavian populations during the 10th and 11th centuries, demonstrates the persistence of Scandinavian immigration even after the end of Danish political control. The renewed Scandinavian invasions that culminated in the conquest of England by Sweyn Forkbeard in 1013, and the subsequent rule of his son, Knut, from 1016 to 1035, brought a final phase of Scandinavian immigration under the auspices of a Danish king who ruled both England and Denmark. Knut's administration of England required the presence of Danish nobles, administrators, and military forces who formed the core of his governing apparatus, creating a political elite that included both Danes and those Anglo-Saxons willing to serve the new regime. The housecarls, professional warriors who formed Knut's military retinue and received grants of land in return for military service, included substantial numbers of Scandinavian warriors who settled permanently in England and established families that would become part of the English aristocracy. The Danish ecclesiastical appointments during Knut's reign brought Scandinavian religious personnel into English sees and monasteries, though the king also maintained and promoted Anglo-Saxon clergy in a deliberate policy of balancing the interests of his Danish and English subjects. The commercial connections between England and Scandinavia intensified during Knut's reign, as merchants could move freely between territories under the same royal authority, generating increased immigration of Scandinavian traders who established operations in English ports and commercial centres. The Norman conquest of 1066 represented the final major migration of the medieval period, introducing a French-speaking aristocracy and ecclesiastical hierarchy that would dominate English political, economic, and cultural life for centuries. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings and subsequent subjugation of English resistance resulted in the wholesale replacement of the Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Scandinavian aristocracy with Norman and French nobles, received confiscated lands as rewards for military service and political loyalty. The scale of this aristocratic replacement becomes apparent in the Domesday Book, compiled 20 years after the conquest to document landholding and resources across the kingdom, which reveals that virtually every major landholding had passed from Anglo-Saxon to Norman control. The immigration of Norman nobility brought not only the individual nobles themselves, but also their families, military retainers, administrative officials, and dependents who collectively numbered in the thousands. The transformation of the English Church through the appointment of Norman bishops and abbots, the establishment of new religious houses following continental monastic models, and the reconstruction of ecclesiastical buildings in the Norman architectural style required the immigration of substantial numbers of French clergy, monks, and craftsmen whose presence reshaped English religious life. The Norman settlement of England proceeded through systematic military consolidation as William established castles across the kingdom to secure territorial control and suppress potential resistance. The construction of these fortifications, initially earthwork and timber structures but increasingly rebuilt in stone during the following decades, required engineers and masons familiar with continental castle design, alongside large numbers of labourers whose forced participation in construction projects generated resentment, documented in contemporary chronicles. The castle building program served multiple functions beyond military necessity, providing secure bases from which Norman lords could administer their estates, symbols of Norman power that intimidated subject populations, and residential complexes that housed not only the lord and his military retinue, but also administrative personnel, craftsmen, and servants who together formed distinct Norman communities within English territories. The garrisoning of castles with Norman knights and men-at-arms created military colonies that maintained cultural separation from surrounding English populations through language, customs, and legal privileges that emphasized their status as conquerors. The archaeological evidence from castle sites reveals material culture that reflects Norman rather than English traditions, including pottery types, architectural details, and burial practices that demonstrate the cultural distinctiveness of these immigrant military communities. The urban centers of Norman England attracted immigrant merchants, craftsmen, and professionals whose skills and continental connections enabled them to profit from the economic opportunities created by the conquest. The reconstruction of London as the primary commercial and administrative center of the kingdom drew Norman and French merchants who established operations in the city and formed communities that maintained their linguistic and cultural distinctiveness. The development of new towns, particularly in strategically important locations or in territories where Norman lords sought to increase revenues from their estates, often involved the deliberate recruitment of immigrant merchants and craftsmen through the grant of privileges and legal protections that made these planned towns attractive destinations. The growth of Norwich, Bristol, and other commercial centres during the century following the conquest reflected both the general economic expansion of the period and the specific stimulus provided by Norman political unification of England with continental territories, particularly Normandy, that facilitated trade between formerly separate economic zones. The Jewish immigration to England, beginning shortly after the conquest and encouraged by Norman rulers who valued Jewish financial expertise and commercial connections, established communities in major towns that would play crucial roles in English economic life until their expulsion in 1290. The Jewish communities that developed in Norman and Plantagenet England represented the first permanent non-Christian immigrant population in medieval England, occupying a distinctive social and economic niche that reflected both their specialized financial skills and their legal status as direct dependents of the crown. The arrival of Jews from Rouen shortly after the conquest, followed by continued immigration from northern France and later from the Rhineland during the 12th century, created communities in London, York, Norwich, Lincoln, and other major towns where Jewish merchants and moneylenders provided credit services that Christian usury prohibitions made difficult for Christians to offer. The legal framework governing Jewish residents in England placed Jews under direct royal protection and jurisdiction, enabling them to engage in money lending and other financial activities, while rendering them vulnerable to royal taxation and, ultimately, to the political decision to expel them when their economic utility to the crown declined relative to the political advantages of seizing their assets and responding to anti-Jewish sentiment among the Christian population. The documentary evidence of Jewish life in medieval England including financial records, legal proceedings, and the architectural remains of Jewish quarters in several towns, reveals communities that maintained strong religious and cultural identities, while necessarily interacting regularly with Christian neighbors in commercial contexts. The intellectual and cultural achievements of English Jewish communities, including scholars whose works influenced the development of Jewish law and exegesis, demonstrate that immigration created not only economic networks, but also centers of learning that contributed to broader European Jewish intellectual life. The economic expansion of the 12th and 13th centuries generated immigration of merchants and craftsmen from various European regions who established operations in England to profit from growing demand for manufactured goods, luxury items, and commercial services that the English economy required as its prosperity increased. The Flemish immigration, initially attracted by opportunities in the wool trade that connected English sheep farming with Flemish cloth manufacturing, established merchant communities in London and eastern ports, where Flemish traders organized the export of raw wool to the Low Countries and the import of finished textiles back to England. The Flemish weavers, who began arriving during the 12th century, brought technical expertise in textile production that enabled the development of English cloth manufacturing, gradually reducing English dependence on imported Flemish fabrics while creating employment for native workers who learned techniques from immigrant craftsmen. The Italian merchant presence in England, particularly representatives of Florentine and Genoese banking houses that established London branches during the 13th century, provided sophisticated financial services, including large-scale loans to the crown, currency exchange, and letters of credit that facilitated international commerce. The Hanseatic merchants from North German cities who established their London trading post, the Steelyard, during the mid-13th century, dominated the trade in Baltic commodities, including timber, pitch, and furs, while exporting English cloth and wool to markets throughout Northern Europe, creating a permanent German merchant presence in London that would persist until the Reformation. The immigration patterns of the high medieval period reflected both the pull of economic opportunity in a prospering English economy and the push of political instability, religious persecution, and economic disruption in various European regions that generated flows of refugees and displaced persons seeking security and livelihood in England. The flight of Flemish weavers during periods of conflict between France and Flanders in the late 13th and early 14th centuries brought skilled textile workers who reinforced the earlier Flemish presence in English towns, contributed to the expansion of English cloth production. The German miners who immigrated to work deposits in the Peak District, Cumberland, and Devon during the 13th and 14th centuries brought expertise in ore extraction and processing that enhanced the productivity of English mining operations, though their presence sometimes generated resentment from English workers who complained about competition for employment and the foreigners' privileged legal status. The physicians from Italy and southern France who practiced in England during the medieval period brought medical knowledge derived from Arabic sources and from the medical schools of Salerno and Montpellier that exceeded the training available in England, making immigrant physicians valuable members of noble households and urban medical communities, despite the language barriers and cultural differences that complicated their integration into English society. The transformation of England's relationship with continental territories through the Plantagenet king's vast holdings in France created patterns of elite movement that blurred distinctions between English and French populations, while generating tensions between those who held lands on both sides of the Channel and those whose interests lay exclusively in England. The Angevin Empire, stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees at its maximum extent under Henry II, required the constant movement of royal officials, aristocrats, and ecclesiastical figures between English and continental territories in service of a monarchy whose attention divided between multiple realms. The collapse of most English continental possessions under King John, confirmed by the Treaty of Paris in 1259, forced nobles who had held lands in both England and France to choose allegiance to one monarchy, generating migration both of French nobles, who chose to abandon their English lands in favour of their French estates, and of English loyalists, who forfeited their continental holdings to maintain their position in England. The 100 Years' War, beginning in 1337 and continuing intermittently until 1453, created additional population movements as English military campaigns in France brought soldiers who sometimes settled in conquered French territories, while periods of English defeat generated return migration of displaced English colonists and flows of French prisoners and hostages whose presence in England awaited ransom payments or political settlements. The Black Death, arriving in England in 1348 and returning in subsequent outbreaks throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, created demographic catastrophe that killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population, while fundamentally transforming economic and social relationships in ways that affected immigration patterns. The massive labour shortage generated by plague mortality increased wages for surviving workers, while creating opportunities for internal and external migration, as labourers moved to regions offering better terms of employment. The collapse of manorial agriculture in many regions, as landlords found themselves unable to maintain traditional labour services when the reduced population could demand wages rather than accepting servile obligations, generated increased labour mobility that included both internal movement of English peasants and the immigration of workers from Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and the continent. The attempts by landlords and government authorities to restrict labour mobility through legislation like the Statute of Labourers of 1351, which sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from seeking better opportunities, proved largely ineffective against market forces that favoured workers in the context of labour scarcity. The social upheaval generated by plague-driven economic transformation contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, while the long-term economic restructuring enabled by depopulation created opportunities for agricultural and commercial innovation that would eventually contribute to England's economic development in subsequent centuries. The expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290, ordered by Edward I as a response to both his own financial difficulties and to growing anti-Jewish sentiment, amplified by accusations of ritual murder and other blood libels, eliminated the most visible non-Christian immigrant community and established a precedent for religiously motivated expulsion that would recur in European history. The confiscation of Jewish property and the cancellation of debts owed to Jewish creditors provided immediate financial benefits to the Crown and to debtors, though the long-term economic consequences of removing a community that had provided essential financial services may have been negative. The absence of a Jewish population from England for nearly 4 centuries, until Oliver Cromwell tacitly permitted Jewish resettlement in the 1650s, distinguished England from many continental territories, where Jewish communities persisted despite periodic persecutions and expulsions from particular cities or regions. The Italian and Flemish merchants who assumed many of the financial functions previously performed by Jewish moneylenders after the expulsion brought different commercial practices and maintained different relationships with royal cross authority, though they too faced periodic hostility and restrictive legislation when their success generated resentment among English merchants who complained about foreign competition. The 100 Years' War and its aftermath created patterns of French immigration to England that included both refugees fleeing war-torn regions of France and collaborators with English occupation who found themselves unable to remain in France after English military defeats. The English occupation of Normandy between 1417 and 1450, established following Henry V's victory at Agincourt and confirmed by the Treaty of Troyes, brought English administrators and soldiers to govern French territories while generating flows of Norman refugees to England who sought to escape the warfare and political instability afflicting their homeland. The final expulsion of English forces from France by 1453, leaving only Calais under English control, generated return migration of English colonists and their French dependents alongside refugees who had collaborated with English authorities and now faced retaliation from the triumphant French monarchy. The settlement of these refugees in England, though relatively small in numbers, established French-speaking communities in London and southern ports, where their commercial connections with France and their linguistic abilities made them valuable intermediaries in cross-channel trade that continued despite the political and military hostilities that had characterized the previous century. The growth of English cloth manufacturing during the 14th and 15th centuries, transforming England from an exporter of raw wool into an exporter of finished textiles, depended partly on the immigration of skilled workers from the Low Countries who brought expertise in weaving, dyeing, and finishing techniques that elevated the quality of English cloth production. The deliberate recruitment of Flemish weavers by English towns and landlords, offering attractive terms, including tax exemptions, housing assistance, and protection from restrictions of English guild regulations that might otherwise have prevented them from practicing their trades, established immigrant communities in East Anglia, the West Country, and other regions where the cloth industry developed. The tensions between immigrant and native workers, manifesting in periodic riots and attacks on foreign craftsmen accused of taking employment from English workers, generated legislative attempts to balance the economic benefits of immigrant expertise against the political necessity of responding to native workers' complaints. The immigration restrictions imposed by Parliament during the 14th and 15th centuries, limiting the rights of foreign workers and requiring them to employ English apprentices, reflected these tensions while attempting to ensure that the technical knowledge brought by immigrants would eventually transfer to native workers who could then sustain the industries without continued dependence on foreign labour. The Wars of the Roses, consuming England in dynastic conflict between 1455 and 1485, generated relatively little immigration compared to earlier and later periods, though the employment of foreign mercenaries by both Yorkist and Lancastrian factions brought continental soldiers whose military service sometimes led to permanent settlement. The Burgundian alliance with the Yorkist cause during Edward IV's reign brought merchants and soldiers from the Low Countries who maintained commercial and political connections between England and Burgundian territories, while the Earl of Richmond's successful invasion from France in 1485, culminating in victory at Bosworth Field and establishment of the Tudor dynasty, involved the recruitment of French and Breton soldiers whose reward for military service sometimes included land grants and positions in the new regime. The political stability established by Henry VII and consolidated by Henry VIII created conditions for renewed economic growth that would generate increased immigration during the 16th century, particularly of religious refugees fleeing persecution on the continent, and of merchants and craftsmen attracted by commercial opportunities in an increasingly prosperous English economy. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic response in the Counter-Reformation generated the most significant religiously motivated immigration to England since the 7th century conversion period, as religious conflicts across Europe displaced populations whose faith made them vulnerable to persecution in territories where authorities enforced religious conformity. The establishment of the Church of England under Henry VIII, though initially motivated by the king's dynastic and political concerns rather than theological principles, created a Protestant realm that would attract Protestant refugees during the subsequent century. The variation in English religious policy under successive monarchs, alternating between Protestant and Catholic orthodoxy, as Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I each implemented different religious settlements, generated both emigration of English religious dissenters seeking refuge abroad and immigration of continental refugees whose religious affiliation aligned with the current English regime. The consolidation of Protestantism under Elizabeth I, following the brief Catholic restoration under Mary, established England as a destination for Protestant refugees from France and the Low Countries, where Catholic authorities conducted increasingly violent campaigns against Protestant populations. The French Protestant refugees, known as Huguenots, who began arriving in England during the 1560s and continued immigrating in increasing numbers through the 17th century, established communities that made lasting contributions to English economic and cultural life. The Huguenot immigration to England included merchants, craftsmen, and professionals whose skills in silk weaving, clockmaking, and various other crafts introduced new techniques, while their commercial connections with France and other European markets facilitated English trade development. The settlement of Huguenot communities in Spitalfields, in London, in Canterbury, Norwich, and other towns willing to accept them, created distinctive neighbourhoods where French language and culture persisted alongside gradual integration into English society through economic cooperation and intermarriage. The legal status of Huguenot refugees, initially somewhat ambiguous, as English authorities balanced sympathy for fellow Protestants against concerns about economic competition with English craftsmen, eventually stabilized through legislation that granted them rights to practice trades and to worship according to their traditions. The contributions of Huguenot immigrants to English economic development, particularly in luxury manufacturing and in banking and commerce, have been credited with accelerating England's economic modernization during the early modern period. The Dutch and Flemish Protestant refugees who fled Spanish persecution in the Low Countries during the late 16th century represented an equally significant immigrant flow that reinforced England's Protestant identity while contributing expertise in various industries and trades. The arrival of substantial numbers of Dutch refugees during the 1560s and 70s, when Spanish military forces under the Duke of Alba conducted brutal campaigns against Protestant populations in the Netherlands, created refugee communities in London and Eastern English towns that maintained connections with the continuing struggle for Dutch independence. The drainage and reclamation of fenland in eastern England during the early 17th century relied heavily on Dutch engineering expertise, as Dutch immigrants who had developed sophisticated techniques for managing water in the Low Countries applied their knowledge to English conditions. The settlement of Dutch engineers, farmers, and craftsmen in the drained fenland regions, particularly around the Wash and in Cambridgeshire, transformed these previously marginal territories into productive agricultural regions while establishing Dutch immigrant communities that maintained their linguistic and cultural distinctiveness for several generations. The period of the English Civil War and interregnum, from 1642 to 1660, generated relatively little immigration compared to the subsequent Restoration period, though the parliamentary cause did attract some foreign volunteers, motivated by Protestant solidarity and opposition to monarchical authority. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 under Charles II, who had spent his exile in Catholic France and maintained sympathies for Catholicism, despite his official adherence to the Church of England, created political conditions that concerned Protestant observers who feared a Catholic revival in England. The arrival of Portuguese Catholic immigrants following Charles II's marriage to Catherine of Braganza in 1662, though limited in numbers, generated controversy and resentment among Protestant Englishmen who viewed the Catholic Queen and her Portuguese retinue with suspicion. The later flight of Charles II's brother James II in 1688, following the Glorious Revolution that brought the Protestant William of Orange to the English throne, confirmed Protestant dominance while generating increased Huguenot immigration as persecutions in France intensified following Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which had granted limited religious toleration to French Protestants, triggered the largest wave of Huguenot immigration to England, as tens of thousands of refugees fled France to escape persecution, forced conversion, and violence. The arrival of approximately 50,000 Huguenot refugees in England between 1685 and 1700 represented a substantial immigration that affected English economic, social, and cultural development. The skills that these refugees brought, particularly in silk weaving and other textile production, established new industries in England while intensifying existing manufacturing activities. The settlement of Huguenot communities in Spitalfields transformed that area into a centre of silk manufacturing that would persist for over a century, while Huguenot settlement in other English towns contributed to the development of linen manufacturing, papermaking, and various luxury crafts. The integration of Huguenot refugees into English society proceeded through gradual processes, as the first generation maintained strong French identity and language, while subsequent generations increasingly identified as English, though maintaining pride in their Huguenot heritage and often preferring to marry within the Huguenot community. The Bank of England's establishment in 1694 included significant participation by Huguenot merchants and financiers, whose experience with continental banking practices and whose international commercial connections contributed to the development of English financial institutions. The Huguenot contribution to English banking, commerce, and manufacturing accelerated during the 18th century as second and third generation immigrants achieved prominent positions in English economic life, while maintaining the international networks inherited from their refugee ancestors. The social integration of Huguenots proceeded more smoothly than might have been expected, given their foreign origins and the traditional English hostility to immigration, partly because their Protestant faith aligned them with the dominant religious establishment, and partly because their valuable economic skills made them welcomed by English authorities, despite periodic complaints from competitors. The naturalization of Huguenot refugees and their descendants through individual acts of parliament, and eventually through more general naturalization legislation, reflected the government's recognition that these immigrants strengthened rather than weakened English society. The 18th century's relatively peaceful conditions, at least compared to the religious wars and civil conflicts of the previous 2 centuries, generated immigration patterns that emphasized economic motivations rather than religious or political refuge. Though political exiles from failed rebellions and religious minorities seeking toleration continued arriving in smaller numbers, the settlement of German Protestant refugees from the Palatinate, who arrived in 1709, in numbers approaching 15,000, represented a substantial immigration episode that generated controversy when English authorities struggled to accommodate and integrate such a large influx within a short period. The Palatine refugees, fleeing the devastation of their homeland by French military campaigns and attracted by British promises of assistance and settlement opportunities, arrived expecting generous support but encountered a government unprepared for their numbers and an English population largely unsympathetic to their plight. The dispersal of Palatine refugees to Ireland and to American colonies, after initial settlement attempts in England, proved problematic, reflected the difficulties that mass immigration could generate, even when authorities were generally sympathetic to the immigrants' circumstances. The Jewish resettlement in England, beginning quietly in the 1650s during Cromwell's protectorate and gradually expanding during the 18th century, re-established a Jewish community after the 3.5-century absence since the medieval expulsion. The Sephardic Jews who formed the first wave of resettlement came primarily from Amsterdam and other Dutch cities, bringing commercial expertise and international trading connections that made them valuable to English economic development. The establishment of the Bevis Marks Synagogue in London in 1701, the first synagogue built in England since the medieval expulsion, marked the public emergence of a Jewish community that had previously maintained low visibility to avoid provoking opposition. The subsequent arrival of Ashkenazi Jews from German and Eastern European territories during the 18th century created a more diverse Jewish population, distinguished by differences in wealth, cultural practices, and religious traditions. The Sephardic community, generally wealthier and more integrated into English commercial elite, maintained social distance from the Ashkenazi immigrants who typically arrived with fewer resources and faced greater challenges in establishing themselves. The Jewish contribution to English economic development during the 18th century extended beyond the prominent merchant families, like the Montefiores and Goldsmiths, to include humble peddlers, craftsmen, and small traders who formed the bulk of the Jewish immigrant population. The growth of London during the 18th century, expanding from approximately 600,000 inhabitants in 1700 to nearly 1 million by 1800, created demand for labour that attracted immigration from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and continental Europe. The Irish immigration to England, initially driven by poverty and limited economic opportunities in Ireland, and accelerating dramatically after the catastrophic famines of the 1840s, would become the largest sustained immigration flow to England in modern history. The 18th century Irish immigration to England, though substantial, remained relatively modest compared to the post-famine influx, consisting primarily of seasonal agricultural workers who crossed to England for harvest work before returning to Ireland, and permanent migrants who settled in English cities, where their willingness to accept low wages and difficult working conditions enabled them to find employment in construction, manufacturing, and various unskilled occupations. The Scottish immigration to England, encouraged by the union of English and Scottish parliaments in 1707, and accelerating after the suppression of the Jacobite rebellions, brought merchants, professionals, and skilled workers whose contributions to English, intellectual, economic, and cultural life was disproportionate to their numbers. The Industrial Revolution that transformed England's economy during the late 18th and early 19th centuries created unprecedented demand for labour that generated massive internal migration from rural to urban areas, attracting continued immigration from Ireland and smaller flows from continental Europe. The development of textile manufacturing in Lancashire, Yorkshire, and other northern regions required enormous numbers of workers who filled the factories and workshops that drove industrial expansion. The construction of canals, roads, and eventually railways necessitated mobile labour forces that moved from project to project, including substantial numbers of Irish workers whose willingness to perform heavy manual labour made them essential to infrastructure development. The growth of industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Sheffield created complex urban environments that attracted diverse populations, including immigrants who established communities within these rapidly expanding metropolitan areas. The social problems generated by rapid urbanization and industrialization, including overcrowding, disease, poverty, and crime, affected immigrant and native-born workers alike, though contemporary observers often blamed urban problems on immigrants whose visible poverty and cultural differences made them convenient scapegoats. The Irish famine immigration of the 1840s represented a humanitarian catastrophe that generated the largest immigration flow to England in the 19th century, as hundreds of thousands of Irish refugees fled starvation, disease, to seek survival in English cities. The arrival of famine refugees, many travelling in conditions of extreme deprivation and bringing diseases including typhus that spread rapidly in the overcrowded urban neighbourhoods where immigrants settled, strained English charitable institutions and generated resentment among English workers who viewed the Irish influx as competition for employment and housing. The concentration of Irish immigrants, in particular urban neighbourhoods, creating distinctive Irish communities in Liverpool, Manchester, London, and other cities, reinforced cultural separation while enabling immigrants to maintain Irish identity and to provide mutual support through informal networks and through institutions like Catholic churches that served immigrant communities. The gradual integration of Irish immigrants, and especially their children, into English society proceeded through economic advancement, intermarriage, and cultural adaptation, though Irish identity persisted and second-generation Irish often maintained strong connections to Ireland through family ties and through involvement in Irish nationalist movements that organised extensively among Irish immigrant communities in England. The Jewish immigration to England during the mid and late 19th century, driven primarily by persecution and poverty in Eastern Europe, transformed English Jewish communities through the arrival of substantial numbers of Ashkenazi Jews whose religious practices, cultural traditions, and socio-economic status differed markedly from the established Anglo-Jewish community descended from earlier Sephardic and German immigrants. The pogroms in the Russian Empire following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 generated the first major wave of Eastern European Jewish immigration, bringing refugees who settled primarily in London's East End, where they established dense immigrant neighbourhoods characterised by Yiddish language, traditional religious observance, and employment in garment manufacturing and other trades. The continued deterioration of conditions for Jews in Eastern Europe, including renewed pogroms and increasing legal restrictions on Jewish economic and residential rights, sustained immigration flows that brought approximately 150,000 Eastern European Jewish immigrants to England between 1880 and 1914. The tensions between established Anglo-Jewish families, who had achieved significant economic success and social acceptance in Victorian England, and the Eastern European immigrants, whose poverty, foreign appearance, and traditional religious practices threatened to provoke anti-Semitic reactions, generated internal Jewish community conflicts over how to assist immigrants while managing their visibility and impact on Jewish communal reputation. The late 19th century also witnessed the arrival of political refugees from various European countries, where revolutionary movements and government suppression generated flows of exiles seeking sanctuary in England. The arrival of German political refugees, following the failed revolutions of 1848, Italian refugees from various stages of the Risorgimento, and Russian revolutionaries fleeing Tsarist persecution created small but intellectually significant immigrant communities in London and other cities. Karl Marx's residence in London from 1849 until his death in 1883 exemplified England's role as refuge for political exiles, while his work at the British Library Reading Room and his political organising among German immigrant workers demonstrated how political refugees maintained connections to their homelands while adapting to life in England. The reluctance of British authorities to extradite political refugees or to restrict their activities, reflecting both liberal political traditions and practical difficulties in monitoring immigrant populations, made England an attractive destination for revolutionaries and political dissidents who found continental European countries less tolerant of their presence. The growth of international commerce and the expansion of the British Empire during the 19th century generated immigration of merchants, professionals, and sailors from various parts of the world, creating small communities of Asian, African, and Middle Eastern immigrants in British ports and in London. The presence of Indian sailors, known as Lascars, who crewed British merchant ships and sometimes remained in Britain between voyages or after discharge from service, created South Asian communities in East London and other ports. The Chinese immigration to Britain, though limited in numbers, established small communities in London and Liverpool, where Chinese sailors and merchants settled, often marrying English women and creating families that maintained aspects of Chinese culture while integrating into English society. The African and Caribbean presence in Britain, including students, sailors, and middle-class professionals, remained numerically small but culturally significant, as these individuals challenged racial assumptions and contributed to debates about empire, slavery, and racial equality that gained increasing prominence during the 19th century. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 and its continuation through 4 years of unprecedented slaughter fundamentally disrupted the patterns of peaceful immigration that had characterized the late 19th and early 20th centuries, while generating new categories of refugees and displaced persons. The Belgian refugees who fled the German invasion and occupation of their country, numbering approximately 250,000 people who arrived in Britain during 1914 and 1915, represented the largest refugee flow in British history to that point. The reception of Belgian refugees, while generally sympathetic due to widespread outrage at German conduct during the invasion, generated some tensions as the influx strained local resources and as initial enthusiasm for assisting refugees waned as the war continued and British civilian populations faced their own hardships. The repatriation of most Belgian refugees after the armistice reflected both their own desire to return home and British government priorities in demobilization and reconstruction. The interwar period witnessed continued but reduced immigration as the economic difficulties of the 1920s and 1930s limited opportunities that might have attracted immigrants, while the rise of restrictive immigration policies reflected growing concerns about unemployment and social stability. The Russian refugees who fled the Bolshevik Revolution and subsequent civil war included both aristocrats and intellectuals who had supported the White Russian cause and found themselves unable to remain in the Soviet Union. The settlement of Russian refugees in Britain, though numbering only a few thousand, included prominent cultural figures whose contributions to British intellectual and artistic life exceeded their numerical significance. The Jewish immigration from Germany and Austria during the 1930s, driven by the Nazi rise to power and the escalating persecution of German and Austrian Jews, brought approximately 60,000 refugees to Britain before the outbreak of World War II. The admission of these refugees, while reflecting humanitarian concerns and recognition of Nazi persecution, operated under increasingly restrictive conditions as British authorities worried about public reactions to immigration during a period of high unemployment, and as they struggled to balance humanitarian obligations against political public pressures to limit foreign arrivals. The Kindertransport program, which brought approximately 10,000 Jewish children from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia to Britain between 1938 and 1939, represented an organized humanitarian response to Nazi persecution that saved thousands of young lives while separating them from parents who in most cases perished in the Holocaust. The reception of Kindertransport children by British families and institutions demonstrated both humanitarian impulses and the practical challenges of integrating displaced children who arrived without families and often without knowledge of English. The long-term impact of the Kindertransport on survivors included both gratitude for their rescue and trauma from family separation and loss that affected these individuals throughout their lives. The Second World War and its immediate aftermath generated enormous population displacements across Europe that affected Britain both through the arrival of refugees and through British military and political involvement in managing displaced persons on the continent. The Polish immigration to Britain, including both soldiers who had fought under British command and civilians who sought refuge from Soviet and German occupation, brought approximately 200,000 Poles who settled in Britain after the war rather than returning to a Poland under Soviet domination. The decision of the British government to permit Polish settlement, initially controversial among those who worried about competition for housing and employment in the difficult post-war years, recognized the obligations created by Polish military service alongside British forces and reflected Cold War political considerations that made demonstrating commitment to anti-communist refugees strategically valuable. The establishment of Polish communities across Britain, maintaining cultural institutions, Catholic churches, and social organizations that preserved Polish identity, while their members gradually integrated into British economic and social life, created lasting immigrant communities that persisted through subsequent generations. The arrival of European voluntary workers, a program initiated by the British government in 1947 to recruit displaced persons from refugee camps in Germany and Austria for employment in British agriculture and essential industries, brought approximately 100,000 Eastern European refugees to Britain under contracts that initially restricted their freedom to change employment, but eventually permitted permanent settlement. The recruitment of these workers reflected desperate labour shortages in the post-war British economy, while providing humanitarian assistance to displaced persons who faced bleak prospects in the refugee camps. The gradual integration of European voluntary workers into British society proceeded as their labour contracts expired, and they gained rights to seek alternative employment and to move freely within Britain, establishing communities and bringing families that contributed to Britain's ethnic diversification. The arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury on June 22, 1948, carrying 492 passengers from Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, marked the symbolic beginning of large-scale immigration from Britain's Caribbean colonies that would transform British society over the subsequent decades. The passengers aboard the Empire Windrush, responding to labour recruitment efforts and to the promise of opportunity in the mother country, included skilled workers, ex-servicemen who had served in the British military during the war, and individuals seeking economic advancement that seemed difficult to achieve in the Caribbean's limited economies. The reception of these arrivals by British authorities reflected ambivalence about immigration from the colonies, with some officials recognising the benefits of addressing labour shortages, while others expressed concerns about racial tensions and social problems that might result from the permanent settlement of non-white immigrants. The initial settlement of Caribbean immigrants in London, particularly in areas like Brixton, Notting Hill, and other neighbourhoods where housing was available, though often of poor quality, created communities that provided support for subsequent arrivals, while establishing cultural presence through churches, social clubs, and businesses serving immigrant populations. The expansion of Caribbean immigration during the 1950s, reaching approximately 300,000 arrivals by 1962, reflected both push factors, including limited economic opportunities in the Caribbean, and pull factors, including active British recruitment of workers for transport, health services, and manufacturing industries experiencing severe labour shortages. The employment of Caribbean immigrants in jobs that native-born British workers were increasingly unwilling to accept, particularly night shifts, physically demanding labour, and roles with low pay and poor conditions, enabled sectors like the National Health Service and London Transport to maintain operations during a period of economic expansion that strained available labour supplies. The concentration of Caribbean immigrants in particular occupations and industries reflected both discriminatory practices that limited their access to better employment and the operation of immigrant networks that directed new arrivals toward employers known to hire Caribbean workers. The experience of Caribbean immigrants in British society included both the promise of opportunity and advancement and the reality of discrimination in employment, housing, and social interactions that contradicted their expectations based on education, emphasizing British imperial benevolence and shared citizenship. The immigration from the Indian subcontinent, initially modest during the 1950s, but accelerating during the 1960s, and particularly after the upheavals surrounding Ugandan independence and Idi Amin's expulsion of Asians in 1972, created South Asian communities across Britain that transformed the ethnic and cultural landscape of many cities. The early South Asian immigrants to Britain included Punjabi men who came as workers during the 1950s and gradually brought families after establishing themselves economically, and East African Asians, many of Gujarati origin, who had migrated initially to British East African colonies and subsequently moved to Britain when African independence movements and discriminatory policies toward Asian minorities made their positions in Africa untenable. The settlement patterns of South Asian immigrants reflected both economic factors, influencing where employment was available, and the operation of chain migration, as early arrivals facilitated subsequent immigration of relatives and fellow villagers from their regions of origin. The establishment of South Asian businesses, serving both immigrant communities and broader British populations, including restaurants, shops, and manufacturing enterprises, contributed to urban economic revitalization in some areas, while generating concerns about competition among British retailers and restaurateurs. The passage of the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1962, restricting immigration from Commonwealth countries for the first time, reflected growing political pressures to limit immigration in response to concerns about racial tensions, pressure on housing and public services, and cultural changes attributed to immigration. The subsequent Immigration Acts of 1968 and 1971 further tightened controls while creating distinctions between citizens with and without right of abode in Britain that effectively discriminated, based on race, by limiting immigration from non-white Commonwealth countries while maintaining freedom of movement for white Commonwealth citizens. The restrictions on primary immigration from the Commonwealth were accompanied by provisions permitting family reunification that sustained continued immigration flows as those already settled in Britain brought spouses and children, generating debates about whether family reunification rights should be curtailed to reduce overall immigration levels. The expulsion of Ugandan Asians by Idi Amin in 1972, giving approximately 60,000 people of South Asian descent 90 days to leave Uganda, created a refugee crisis that tested British commitment to its citizens and former colonial subjects. The British government's decision to admit approximately 28,000 Ugandan Asian refugees, despite considerable public opposition and concerns about the capacity to absorb such an influx, reflected legal obligations to British passport holders and humanitarian considerations that outweighed political pressures to exclude them. The reception and resettlement of Ugandan Asians, managed through coordinated efforts involving government agencies and voluntary organizations, became regarded as a generally successful integration process, as these refugees, many arriving with business experience and education, established themselves relatively quickly and contributed to British economic and social life. The subsequent success of many Ugandan Asian immigrants in business and professional occupations contrasted with narratives suggesting immigration imposed costs on British society, demonstrating instead that refugees could become net contributors when provided appropriate support and opportunities. The Vietnamese refugees who arrived in Britain during the late 1970s and early 1980s, fleeing communist rule following the fall of Saigon, and often enduring harrowing escapes by sea that earned them the designation boat people, represented another refugee population that tested British humanitarian commitments. The admission of approximately 24,000 Vietnamese refugees between 1979 and 1992 under various resettlement programs reflected both humanitarian concerns and Cold War political considerations that made assisting refugees from communist regimes strategically desirable. The settlement of Vietnamese refugees through dispersal policies designed to prevent concentration in particular areas and to facilitate integration achieved mixed results, as refugees frequently relocated from initial settlement areas to join Vietnamese communities in particular cities, particularly London and Birmingham, where ethnic networks provided support and business opportunities. The economic integration of Vietnamese refugees proceeded through family businesses, particularly restaurants and shops, and through educational achievement by second-generation Vietnamese, who often excelled in British schools and moved into professional occupations. The asylum applications that increased dramatically during the 1980s and 1990s, including refugees from Sri Lankan civil war, Kurdish populations fleeing persecution in Turkey and Iraq, and Somalis escaping clan warfare and state collapse, created political controversies about asylum policy and about Britain's obligations under international refugee law. The rising numbers of asylum seekers, from approximately 5,000 applications annually in the 1980s to over 80,000 by 1999, generated political debate about whether applicants were genuine refugees or economic migrants exploiting asylum procedures to circumvent immigration controls. The processing of asylum applications, often involving lengthy delays that left applicants in uncertain legal limbo while preventing them from working legally, created humanitarian concerns, while the dispersal of asylum seekers to areas outside London generated tensions in communities unaccustomed to receiving immigrants. The enlargement of the European Union, and particularly the accession of 8 Eastern European countries in 2004, created the most significant change in British immigration policy of the post-war period, as citizens of new member states gained rights to work in Britain without requiring work permits. The decision by the British government to impose no transitional controls on immigration from the new member states, unlike most existing EU members who implemented temporary restrictions, reflected economic assessments that Britain could benefit from increased labour mobility and political commitments to European integration. The scale of immigration from Eastern Europe, particularly from Poland but also including substantial numbers from Lithuania, Latvia, Slovakia, and other new member states, far exceeded government projections that had estimated annual arrivals of approximately 13,000 workers. The actual arrivals reached hundreds of thousands annually during the mid-2000s, creating the largest wave of immigration to Britain since the immediate post-war period, and generating political debates that would ultimately contribute to the Brexit referendum. The employment of Eastern European immigrants in agriculture, food processing, construction, and service industries addressed labour shortages while creating concerns about wage depression, working conditions, and pressure on public services in areas experiencing rapid immigration. The settlement patterns of Eastern European immigrants, initially characterized by intentions to work temporarily and return home, but increasingly involving permanent settlement as immigrants brought families and established communities, transformed many British towns and cities through the presence of Polish shops, Catholic churches offering Polish language services, and schools dealing with substantial numbers of children whose first language was not English. The economic impacts of Eastern European immigration remained contested, with studies suggesting net positive fiscal contributions and economic benefits from increased labour supply, competing with concerns about impacts on wages for low-skilled British workers and strains on housing and public services, high immigration areas. The Syrian refugee crisis, beginning in 2011 and intensifying through 2015, created renewed debates about British obligations to refugees and about the appropriate balance between humanitarian concerns and practical constraints on refugee admission. The British government's decision to admit 20,000 Syrian refugees over 5 years through the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, while resisting EU proposals for mandatory refugee quotas, reflected attempts to demonstrate humanitarian concern while maintaining control over immigration numbers and responding to public skepticism about immigration. The selection of refugees for resettlement directly from camps in the Middle East, rather than from asylum seekers already in Europe, aimed to discourage dangerous Mediterranean crossings, while focusing on the most vulnerable cases, including Dunkleute, families with children, survivors of violence and torture, and individuals with medical needs. The Brexit referendum of 2016, resulting in a narrow majority voting to leave the European Union, reflected multiple factors, including concerns about immigration levels, perceived loss of sovereignty over immigration policy, and anxieties about cultural change and national identity in a period of rapid social transformation. The implementation of Brexit through British withdrawal from the European Union in 2020 required the creation of new immigration policies, applying equally to EU and non-EU citizens, ending the principle of free movement that had enabled unrestricted immigration from European Union member states. The new points-based immigration system, implemented from January 2021, aimed to prioritize high-skilled workers while restricting routes for lower-skilled immigration, representing a fundamental shift towards selectivity that contrasted with the openness to EU migration during the previous decade and a half. The arrival of substantial numbers of Hong Kong residents following China's imposition of the National Security Law in 2020, facilitated by the creation of a special visa route for British national overseas passport holders and their families, represented the most significant immigration flow during the early 2020s. The estimate that approximately 300,000 Hong Kong residents might migrate to Britain over several years under this scheme reflected both the scale of concern about political freedoms in Hong Kong and the particular types, responsibilities Britain felt toward Hong Kong residents based on its former colonial administration. The settlement of Hong Kong immigrants, generally arriving with education, resources, and language skills that facilitated economic integration, proceeded with less controversy than some previous immigration flows, though concerns emerged about capacity of schools and housing markets in areas experiencing concentrations of new arrivals. The channel crossings by asylum seekers in small boats, becoming an increasingly prominent route for irregular immigration from 2018 onward, and reaching tens of thousands of arrivals annually by the early 2020s, generated intense political debate about border control, asylum policy, and obligations under international law. The British government's proposals to deter irregular arrivals through processing asylum claims in Rwanda and through other measures designed to demonstrate that irregular entry would not lead to permission to remain in Britain faced legal challenges and international criticism, while reflecting frustration with inability to control irregular immigration through existing mechanisms. The debates surrounding small boat crossings exemplified broader tensions between humanitarian obligations to refugees, security concerns about uncontrolled borders, and political pressures to demonstrate effective immigration management. The COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath created temporary disruptions to immigration patterns, while also revealing the dependence of essential services on immigrant workers whose contributions during lockdowns and health crises demonstrated the integration of immigration into core functions of British society. The recognition of healthcare workers, care home staff, and other essential workers, many of whom were immigrants, as key workers whose labour sustained critical services during the pandemic, generated some shift in public discourse about immigration, away from exclusive focus on costs and problems toward appreciation of contributions. The post-pandemic labour shortages across multiple sectors, including hospitality, agriculture, and social care, partly resulting from reduced EU immigration following Brexit and pandemic disruptions, created pressures to expand immigration routes, despite political commitments to reduce overall immigration numbers. The contemporary patterns of immigration to England reflect complex combinations of historical trajectories, economic forces, political decisions, and humanitarian obligations that collectively have transformed England from a relatively ethnically homogeneous society in the mid-20th century into one of Europe's most diverse nations. The evolution from Romano-British cosmopolitanism through centuries of Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Norman migrations through medieval religious and economic immigration, through early modern religious refugees, through Irish and Jewish immigration of the 19th century, through post-war Commonwealth immigration, through European enlargement, to contemporary patterns involving global origins, demonstrates the persistent role of immigration in shaping English society across more than 2 millennia. The archaeological record, documentary evidence, and lived experience of immigrant communities collectively reveal that immigration has been not an aberration, but a constant in English history, with each wave of new arrivals generating similar patterns of initial resistance and eventual integration that have enriched English culture, while periodically generating tensions that reflect deeper anxieties about change, identity, and belonging. The ongoing debates about immigration policy, integration, and national identity in contemporary England echo concerns expressed in Roman Britain, in Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, in medieval towns, and in every subsequent period, demonstrating both the persistence of human reactions to demographic change and the proven capacity of English society to absorb and benefit from successive waves of immigration across its long and complex history. The demographic transformation of specific English regions and cities through immigration reveals patterns of settlement, concentration, and dispersal that reflect both the preferences and constraints facing immigrant communities and the structural characteristics of local economies, housing markets, and social networks that channeled particular immigrant groups towards certain destinations. The East End of London, serving as primary reception area for successive waves of immigration, from the Huguenots through Irish labourers to Eastern European Jews to Bangladeshi immigrants of the late 20th century, exemplifies how particular neighbourhoods develop specialised roles in immigrant incorporation through the accumulation of ethnic infrastructure, including places of worship, shops serving ethnic markets, mutual aid societies, and informal networks, providing information and assistance to new arrivals. The transformation of Spitalfields from a Huguenot silk-weaving district in the 18th century through a Jewish garment manufacturing centre in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to a predominantly Bangladeshi area by the late 20th century demonstrates both the continuity of the neighbourhood's immigrant reception function and the succession of different immigrant groups through the same physical space as earlier groups achieved economic mobility and moved to more prosperous areas. The preservation of the Huguenot Christchurch Spitalfields and its conversion to various uses as the neighbourhood's population changed, the survival of Georgian houses built by Huguenot silk merchants that later housed Jewish workshops and subsequently Bangladeshi families, and the layering of ethnic commercial districts as Bengali curry houses and sari shops replaced Jewish bagel bakeries and kosher butchers that had themselves replaced Huguenot silk warehouses, creates a physical palimpsest documenting successive immigrations through architectural and commercial landscape. The experience of Birmingham, England's second largest city, in receiving and incorporating Caribbean and South Asian immigration during the post-war decades, reveals how industrial cities outside London developed distinctive patterns of immigrant settlement and integration, shaped by local economic structures and political cultures. The recruitment of Caribbean workers by Birmingham's manufacturing industries during the 1950s and 60s, particularly in the automotive sector, dominated by companies like British Leyland, created concentrations of Caribbean settlement in areas like Handsworth and Aston, where proximity to factories and availability of affordable housing made these neighbourhoods logical destinations. The subsequent arrival of South Asian immigrants, initially primarily Punjabi Sikhs during the 1950s and 60s, followed by increased Pakistani and Bangladeshi immigration during the 1970s and 80s, generated distinctive ethnic geographies as different communities concentrated in different neighbourhoods, based partly on employment opportunities, partly on housing market dynamics, and partly on the operation of chain migration channeling new arrivals toward areas where earlier immigrants from the same regions had established themselves. The political incorporation of immigrant communities in Birmingham proceeded through engagement with local Labour Party structures that recognised immigrant voters as important constituencies, leading to the election of immigrant and second-generation representatives to City Council and eventually to Parliament, while also generating tensions within the Labour Party between traditional white working-class constituencies and newer immigrant origin voters, whose priorities and perspectives sometimes differed from those of long-established residents. The transformation of Leicester from a predominantly white industrial city in the mid-20th century into Britain's first city, where ethnic minorities constituted the majority of the population by the early 21st century, demonstrates the scale of demographic change that immigration produced in particular localities. The arrival of substantial numbers of East African Asians during the 1970s, following expulsions and discriminatory policies in Kenya and Uganda, established Leicester as a major centre of Gujarati settlement, where success in retail and manufacturing businesses generated visible prosperity that attracted subsequent immigration from both East Africa and directly from Gujarat. The concentration of South Asian businesses along particular commercial corridors, the establishment of temples, mosques, and gurudwaras serving different religious communities within the broader South Asian immigrant population, and the development of specialized retail districts catering to both ethnic communities and broader populations interested in South Asian goods, created distinctive urban landscapes that marked Leicester as transformed by immigration. The relative absence of severe racial conflict in Leicester, compared to some other cities experiencing large-scale immigration, despite the dramatic pace of demographic change, has been attributed to various factors, including deliberate efforts by city officials and community leaders to manage integration, the economic success of immigrant communities that reduced competition for scarce resources, and the particular characteristics of Gujarati immigrants who arrived with business experience and capital that facilitated rapid economic establishment. The experience of Bradford, a northern industrial city that received substantial Pakistani immigration during the 1950s through 1970s, and subsequently faced economic decline as textile manufacturing collapsed, reveals how the intersection of immigration and deindustrialization created particularly acute challenges for immigrant integration and intercommunal relations. The recruitment of Pakistani workers, primarily from the Mirpur district of Azad Kashmir, to work in Bradford's wool textile mills during the 1950s and 60s established chains of migration that continued even as the industry that had attracted the initial immigration entered terminal decline from the 1970s onward. The concentration of Pakistani immigrant families in inner-city neighborhoods, characterized by substandard housing, inadequate public services, and limited economic opportunities, combined with cultural and linguistic differences that complicated engagement with educational institutions and social services, created conditions of marginalization that persisted into subsequent generations. The racialization of economic and social problems, whereby unemployment, educational underachievement, and social dysfunction in Pakistani origin communities were attributed to cultural deficiencies rather than to structural economic changes and discriminatory practices, generated political narratives that blamed immigrants and their descendants for problems whose roots lay in broader processes of economic transformation and inadequate policy responses. The Bradford riots of 2001, involving violent confrontations between young men of Pakistani origin and far-right activists that resulted in extensive property damage and hundreds of arrests, crystallized concerns about failed integration and the development of parallel communities living alongside each other without meaningful social connection or mutual understanding. The Cantle Report, commissioned following the 2001 disturbances in Bradford, Oldham, and Burnley, identified community cohesion as a policy priority and argued that segregation along ethnic and religious lines had created communities leading parallel lives with minimal interaction across ethnic boundaries. The report's recommendations emphasizing increased cross-cultural contact, shared values, and civic integration reflected anxieties about multiculturalism and concerns that policies celebrating diversity had inadvertently undermined social cohesion by permitting or encouraging ethnic communities to maintain separation from mainstream society. The policy shift toward community cohesion and subsequently toward integration and British values reflected both genuine concerns about social fragmentation in areas experiencing rapid demographic change and political pressures to respond, to public anxieties about immigration and cultural difference. The debates surrounding these policy developments revealed tensions between perspectives, emphasizing immigrants' responsibilities to integrate and adopt British values and perspectives, arguing that integration required addressing discrimination, inequality, and structural barriers that prevented full participation, regardless of immigrants' willingness to adapt to British cultural norms. The expansion of immigration from Africa during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, including substantial flows from Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Somalia, Eritrea, and other African nations, diversified Britain's African origin population beyond the earlier Caribbean immigrants of African descent, and created new patterns of settlement and community formation. The Nigerian immigration to Britain, driven by combinations of political instability, economic difficulties, and educational opportunities, brought populations distinguished by high levels of educational attainment and professional aspirations that differentiated Nigerian immigrants from stereotypes of African poverty and underdevelopment. The concentration of Nigerian immigrants in London, particularly in areas like Peckham, where Nigerian businesses, churches, and social organizations created visible Nigerian community presence, established ethnic infrastructure, supporting subsequent arrivals, while generating economic activity that contributed to neighborhood revitalization. The Somali immigration, initially consisting of sailors who had served on British merchant ships and settled in port cities like Cardiff and Liverpool, expanded dramatically during the 1980s and 90s as civil war and state collapse in Somalia generated refugee flows seeking asylum in Britain. The particular challenges facing Somali refugees, including trauma from conflict and displacement, difficulties in transferring educational credentials and professional qualifications, cultural and linguistic barriers to employment and social integration, and discrimination based on visible Muslim identity, created patterns of marginalization and welfare dependency that generated both humanitarian concern and political criticism about refugee policy. The Polish immigration following EU enlargement in 2004, exceeding all official projections and bringing somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Polish citizens to Britain during the subsequent decade, represented the largest single nationality immigrant flow in British history and generated transformations in both urban and rural areas that received substantial Polish populations. The settlement of Polish immigrants extended beyond traditional immigrant reception areas in London and other major cities to include smaller towns and rural regions where agricultural and food processing industries recruited Polish workers whose willingness to accept wages and conditions that British workers rejected made them attractive employees, despite language barriers and unfamiliarity with British workplace norms. The town of Boston in Lincolnshire, where the Polish population grew from virtually zero in 2004 to approximately 10% of residents by 2011, experienced transformation that included the opening of Polish shops, the provision of Polish language services by local government and health providers, and the establishment of Polish Catholic masses that created visible evidence of demographic change in a town that had been ethnically homogeneous within living memory. The rapidity of this transformation, compressed into less than a decade, generated tensions between established residents who felt their community had changed beyond recognition without their consent, and Polish immigrants who often felt unwelcome and subject to discrimination despite their legal right to reside and work in Britain. The vote in Boston for Brexit in 2016, with nearly 76% supporting leaving the European Union in the highest proportion of any local authority in Britain, reflected these tensions and the political mobilization of anxieties about immigration and cultural change. The residential segregation patterns that developed in many British cities and towns, whereby particular ethnic groups concentrated in specific neighborhoods, often characterized by poorer housing quality, limited economic opportunities, and underperforming schools, generated ongoing debates about whether such segregation resulted primarily from immigrant preferences for residential proximity to co-ethnics, or from discriminatory practices by landlords, real estate agents, and mortgage lenders that restricted immigrants' residential choices. The The scholarship on residential segregation, employing dissimilarity indices and other statistical measures to quantify the extent of ethnic residential separation, revealed higher levels of segregation for some groups, particularly Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, than for others, including Indians and Caribbean populations, suggesting that factors beyond simple immigrant preference influence settlement patterns. The role of social housing allocation in concentrating particular immigrant groups in specific estates and neighborhoods, whether through deliberate policies or through the intersection of eligibility requirements and housing availability, contributed to segregation patterns, while also providing affordable housing that might otherwise have been inaccessible. The white flight phenomenon, whereby the arrival of substantial immigrant populations in particular neighborhoods triggered departure of white residents who preferred more ethnically homogeneous areas, operated through housing market mechanisms that channeled different ethnic groups toward different neighborhoods in self-reinforcing patterns that increased segregation over time. The educational experiences and outcomes of immigrant children and children of immigrants revealed complex patterns of achievement and disadvantage that varied considerably across different ethnic groups and that changed across generations, in ways that complicated simplistic narratives about either immigrant success or failure. The initially poor educational performance of Caribbean immigrant children during the 1960s and 70s, documented in studies showing disproportionate placement in special education classes and lower examination results compared to white British students, generated concerns about educational disadvantage and discrimination that prompted research into teacher expectations, cultural bias in assessment, and structural barriers to achievement. The second-generation experiences of children born in Britain to immigrant parents revealed diverse trajectories of integration, identity formation, and socioeconomic mobility that defied simple predictions about inevitable progress from immigrant disadvantage to full integration over generations. The concept of segmented assimilation, developed by sociologists studying immigrant incorporation in the United States, and applied to the British context by scholars examining outcomes for different ethnic minority groups, suggested that second-generation trajectories varied considerably, depending on factors, including the resources immigrant parents brought, the reception context in British society, and the structure of opportunities available in particular localities and labour markets. The cultural contributions of immigrant communities to British popular culture, cuisine, music, literature, and the arts transformed British cultural life while generating debates about multiculturalism, cultural appropriation, and the boundaries of Britishness. The transformation of British cuisine through the incorporation of South Asian, Caribbean, Chinese, and other immigrant food traditions created a culinary landscape where chicken tikka masala could be characterized as Britain's national dish, and where curry houses became ubiquitous features of British high streets in ways that reflected both genuine cultural mixing and commercial adaptation of ethnic cuisines to British palates. The emergence of British Asian music scenes blending South Asian musical traditions with British popular music genres, the success of British Caribbean artists in reggae, jungle, grime, and other musical styles that became recognized as distinctively British forms, and the international success of British artists from immigrant backgrounds in literature, visual arts, and performance all demonstrated creative cultural synthesis emerging from immigrant experience. The ongoing debates about whether such cultural hybridity represented successful multiculturalism or problematic dilution of both British and immigrant cultural traditions, whether commercial success of ethnic restaurants and music represented genuine integration or superficial engagement with immigrant cultures, and whether celebration of cultural diversity adequately addressed persistent inequalities and discrimination affecting immigrant communities, revealed tensions in how cultural change and demographic transformation should be understood and evaluated. The establishment of ethnic media serving immigrant communities, including newspapers, television programming, and increasingly internet-based platforms providing content in immigrant languages and addressing immigrant community concerns, created parallel information ecosystems that enabled immigrants to maintain connections with homelands and to access content in familiar languages, while potentially reducing engagement with mainstream British media and the shared information environment it provided. The proliferation of Polish shops, Baltic food stores, African hair salons, South Asian groceries, and other ethnically specific retail establishments that emerged in areas with concentrated immigrant populations transformed commercial landscapes while serving both practical needs of immigrant consumers seeking familiar products and symbolic functions in maintaining cultural practices and community identities. The provision of translation services, multilingual signage, and culturally sensitive service delivery by public institutions, including schools, hospitals, and local government offices, responded to demographic diversity while generating debates about costs, about whether provision of services in multiple languages discouraged English language learning, and about whether limited resources should be devoted to accommodating linguistic diversity or concentrated on core service provision. The religious landscape of contemporary England reflects the transformation wrought by immigration from predominantly Christian society in the mid-20th century to religious plurality, including substantial Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, and other religious communities whose presence required accommodation of diverse religious practices and negotiation of tensions between secular public institutions and demands for religious recognition. The growth of British Islam from virtually negligible presence in the mid-20th century to approximately 5% of the English population by the early 21st century, concentrated particularly in areas of Pakistani and Bangladeshi settlement, but including diverse Muslim populations from Arab countries, Somalia, Turkey, Afghanistan, and other regions, created Britain's largest non-Christian religious minority and generated extensive debate about integration, security, and the compatibility of Islamic practice with British values and institutions. The construction of purpose-built mosques replacing converted buildings that had served as early Muslim places of worship, the development of Islamic schools and cultural centres, the emergence of British Muslim organisations claiming to represent Muslim community interests, and the increasing visibility of Islamic dress and practice in public spaces all marked the permanent establishment of Islam as part of British religious landscape, while triggering concerns among some British non-Muslims about parallel communities, about radicalisation and terrorism, and about challenges to secular principles in public life. The terrorist attacks in London on July 7, 2005, carried out by 4 British-born Muslims of Pakistani and Jamaican heritage, who killed 52 people and injured hundreds more in coordinated suicide bombings on public transport, profoundly affected public discourse about Muslim integration and raised urgent questions about radicalisation within British Muslim communities. The discovery that the perpetrators were not foreign terrorists infiltrating Britain, but homegrown extremists who had grown up in Britain and appeared to many who knew them as reasonably well integrated, intensified concerns about whether British Muslim communities harboured hostile elements and whether multiculturalist policies had permitted the development of ideological spaces where violent extremism could develop. The expansion of counter-terrorism policies, including the PREVENT programme designed to identify and intervene with individuals at risk of radicalisation, generated controversy about effectiveness, about potential stigmatization of Muslim communities, and about whether security-focused approaches adequately addressed the complex social, political, and ideological factors contributing to violent extremism. The tensions between security imperatives requiring surveillance and investigation of potential terrorist threats and civil liberties, concerns about profiling, discrimination, and the erosion of privacy and due process protections created ongoing conflicts that the inherently secretive nature of security operations made difficult to resolve through public deliberation. The debates about forced marriage, honor violence, female genital mutilation, and other practices associated with particular immigrant communities brought questions about cultural relativism, women's rights, and the limits of tolerance to the forefront of discussions about immigration and integration. The documentation of cases where young women from South Asian backgrounds were forced into marriages against their will, sometimes through deception, about travel to ancestral countries, where families arranged marriages that British law would not recognise as valid without genuine consent, prompted government action, including the establishment of a forced marriage unit providing support to victims and the criminalization of forced marriage in 2014. The horrific murders of women, including Banaz Mahmoud, Shafilia Ahmed, and others killed by family members in so-called honor killings when they resisted arranged marriages or otherwise violated family expectations about appropriate female behavior, generated public outrage and demands for more effective intervention to protect vulnerable women from cultural practices incompatible with British legal and moral norms regarding individual autonomy and women's rights. The practice of female genital mutilation, brought to Britain by immigrants from regions of East Africa, Egypt, and elsewhere, where the practice remained common despite international campaigns against it, posed particular challenges for enforcement, as the private nature of the practice and community solidarity protecting practitioners made investigation and prosecution extremely difficult, despite the practice being illegal in Britain since 1985. The emergence of far-right political movements explicitly opposing immigration and mobilizing white working-class resentment about demographic change, economic insecurity, and perceived cultural threats created political tensions that mainstream parties struggled to address effectively. The British National Party's electoral successes during the early 21st century, including winning seats on local councils and briefly gaining representation in the European Parliament, demonstrated that anti-immigration politics could achieve electoral traction even if the party remained marginal in national politics. The English Defence League's street demonstrations ostensibly protesting Islamic extremism, but effectively promoting anti-Muslim sentiment and generating violent confrontations attracted significant participation from white, working-class men who felt their concerns about immigration and cultural change were ignored by political elites. The subsequent emergence of the UK Independence Party as a more mainstream vehicle for anti-immigration politics initially focused primarily on opposing European Union membership, but increasingly emphasizing immigration restriction as its central message, demonstrated that concerns about immigration extended well beyond the traditional far-right constituency, and that mainstream politicians could no longer dismiss such concerns as simply racist without facing electoral consequences. The integration of immigration concerns into mainstream political debate, with all major parties eventually acknowledging that uncontrolled immigration generated legitimate concerns that required policy responses, reflected both genuine shifts in public opinion and strategic calculations about electoral necessity. The Conservative Party's repeated commitments to reducing net migration to tens of thousands annually, first articulated by David Cameron in 2010, and maintained through successive Conservative governments despite never achieving the stated target, demonstrated both the political salience of immigration concerns and the practical difficulties of controlling immigration in an interconnected global economy, where labour mobility responded to market forces resistant to political manipulation. The Labour Party's evolution from strong support for multicultural policies and relatively open immigration during the new Labour years under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown to greater emphasis on integration, community cohesion, and controlled immigration under Ed Miliband and subsequent leaders reflected recognition that traditional Labour constituencies increasingly viewed immigration sceptically, and that failure to acknowledge such concerns risked electoral marginalisation. The political challenge of balancing economic arguments about immigration's fiscal and economic benefits, humanitarian obligations to refugees and asylum seekers, and public concerns about cultural change, wage competition, and pressure on public services created tensions that no party successfully resolved in ways that satisfied both pro-immigration and anti-immigration constituencies. The Brexit referendum campaign of 2016 demonstrated the central political importance that immigration had assumed, with control over immigration policy emerging as arguably the most significant issue distinguishing the Leave and Remain campaigns. The Leave campaign's emphasis on taking back control resonated particularly powerfully in relation to immigration, where EU membership and freedom of movement prevented British governments from restricting immigration from EU member states, regardless of public opinion or political preferences. The Vote Leave campaign's controversial claims about Turkish accession to the EU potentially bringing millions of Turkish immigrants to Britain, while factually misleading given the remote prospects of Turkish accession, proved politically effective in mobilizing concerns about uncontrolled immigration. The implicit racial and cultural dimensions of immigration concerns, with opposition generally strongest to immigration from Muslim-majority countries and from Eastern Europe, while more favorable toward immigration from Commonwealth countries with historical ties to Britain, complicated claims that immigration concerns were purely economic or purely about numbers rather than about the identity and cultural background of immigrants. The geographical pattern of the Brexit vote, with strongest leave support in areas that had experienced rapid recent immigration, particularly from Eastern Europe, and also in areas with relatively little immigration, but where economic decline and social change generated anxieties, projected onto immigration, demonstrated that immigration's political significance extended beyond direct experience to include symbolic importance as a focus for broader concerns about loss of control, cultural change, and threats to traditional ways of life. The implementation of the post-Brexit points-based immigration system, introduced on January 1, 2021, created the most significant change in British immigration policy since the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962, by ending the distinction between EU and non-EU nationals and establishing a supposedly uniform system, judging prospective immigrants by criteria including skills, qualifications, and salary levels, rather than by nationality. The new system's emphasis on high-skilled immigration and its initial lack of routes for lower-skilled workers reflected political commitments to reduce overall immigration while ensuring that businesses could access talent needed for economic growth. The rapid reintroduction of temporary routes for seasonal agricultural workers and subsequently for other lower-skilled sectors, including social care and hospitality, after businesses complained vociferously about labor shortages, demonstrated that political rhetoric about controlling immigration and economic reality of labor market needs remained in tension. The complexity of the post-Brexit immigration system, involving multiple visa categories with different requirements, fees of hundreds or thousands of pounds for visa applications, and administrative burdens, particularly challenging for smaller employers who lacked experience navigating immigration procedures, created practical difficulties that undermined some of the anticipated benefits of the new system. The question of how immigration has affected wages, employment, and working conditions for British workers remains intensely debated among economists, with empirical studies reaching varying conclusions depending on methodological approaches, time periods examined, and particular labour market segments analysed. The broad consensus among economists that immigration has had relatively modest effects on average wages and employment rates for native workers at the national level coexists with evidence suggesting more significant effects, in particular, occupations, industries, and local labour markets, where immigrant concentration reached levels where substantial wage competition occurred. The distinction between short-run effects immediately following immigration increases when labour supply expanded faster than capital investment and labour demand adjusted, and long-run effects after businesses adjusted to availability of immigrant labour through investment and expansion, complicates assessment of immigration's economic impacts. The distributional question of how any negative wage effects concentrated among particular groups of workers, particularly the low-skilled and those in occupations where immigrants competed directly for employment, versus how benefits of immigration, including lower consumer prices, increased innovation, and fiscal contributions distributed across the broader population, raises issues of fairness and political sustainability that purely aggregate economic analyses struggle to address. The argument that opposition to immigration among working-class voters reflected accurate perception of economic interests threatened by wage competition and weakened bargaining power competes with arguments that such opposition reflected primarily cultural anxieties manipulated by political entrepreneurs who scapegoated immigrants for economic problems caused by deindustrialization, austerity policies, and structural economic changes unrelated to immigration. The fiscal impacts of immigration, involving complex calculations of tax contributions by immigrants versus their consumption of public services and benefits, similarly generate contested conclusions, depending on assumptions about how costs and benefits are measured and attributed. The calculation that immigrants on average are net fiscal contributors when viewed across their entire life cycle, with working-age immigrants contributing more in taxes than they consume in public services, while elderly, native-born citizens tend to be net fiscal burdens due to pension and healthcare costs, supports arguments that immigration strengthens public finances and helps address challenges of aging populations. The counter-argument that immigrants eventually age and will generate future fiscal costs, that some categories of immigrants, including refugees and asylum seekers, tend to have lower employment rates and higher benefit dependency than native-born populations, and that immigrant children impose educational costs while their future tax contributions remain uncertain, challenges optimistic fiscal assessments. The distributional dimension of fiscal impacts, whereby immigrants may generate net positive fiscal contributions nationally while imposing pressures on public services, particularly in local authorities with high immigrant concentrations, creates political tensions between national-level analyses, suggesting immigration benefits, public finances, and local experiences of strained schools, healthcare services, and housing markets where immigration's costs concentrate. The question of whether public services received adequate additional funding to manage increased demand from immigration, or whether funding formulas failed to adjust sufficiently quickly to demographic changes, affects whether immigration's fiscal impacts appear positive or negative in practice. The integration of second and third generation immigrants into British national identity and their relationship with both their ethnic heritage and British identity reveals complex patterns of hyphenated and hybrid identities that defy simple categorization as either successfully integrated or alienated from British society. The emergence of distinctively British ethnic identities, including British Asian, Black British, and various more specific formulations like British Pakistani or British Nigerian, reflects attempts to synthesize ethnic heritage with British national identity, rather than viewing these as mutually exclusive alternatives. The variation across different ethnic communities in how strongly second and third generation members identify with ethnic heritage versus British identity, with some groups maintaining strong connections to ancestral cultures and languages, while others show rapid attenuation of distinctive ethnic identity, reflects factors including community institutional strength, residential concentration, facilitating cultural maintenance, transnational connections enabled by modern communications and transport, and the reception context determining whether minority ethnic identity is valorized or stigmatized. The role of discrimination and exclusion in strengthening ethnic identification, as individuals who would prefer to identify primarily as British find themselves categorized and sometimes treated as fundamentally foreign regardless of birth and upbringing in Britain, complicates narratives about integration failure by suggesting that full integration requires not only immigrant adaptation, but also majority acceptance of ethnic minorities as genuinely British. The phenomenon of transnationalism, whereby immigrants and their descendants maintain significant ties with countries of origin through regular visits, remittances, participation in origin country politics, and consumption of origin country media and culture, challenges traditional assumptions about immigrant integration, requiring severing of homeland ties and exclusive focus on receiving society. The facilitation of transnational practices through technological change, including affordable international telecommunications, internet connectivity, enabling real-time connection with origin countries, and inexpensive air travel making regular visits feasible, has created possibilities for maintaining homeland connections that were impractical for earlier immigrant generations, who often experience migration as permanent rupture. The economic dimensions of transnationalism, including substantial remittance, flows from Britain to immigrant-sending countries, estimated at billions of pounds annually, demonstrate immigrants' continuing financial obligations to origin country family members, while raising questions about whether such obligations reduce immigrants' ability to invest in their own advancement and integration in Britain. The political dimensions of transnationalism, including immigrants' participation in origin country elections, sometimes through voting in origin country elections held in Britain, or through proxy voting, and immigrants' organization around origin country political issues, generate concerns about divided loyalties and about whether such transnational engagement undermines identification with British national interests. The argument that transnationalism represents not failure of integration but rather a new mode of immigrant incorporation, reflecting contemporary possibilities for sustaining connections across national borders, challenges assumptions that successful integration requires exclusive loyalty and identification with receiving society. The impact of immigration on Britain's international connections and soft power through diaspora networks, connecting Britain with countries around the world, represents an often overlooked dimension of immigration's consequences that operates through channels distinct from domestic economic and social effects. The presence of substantial Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi diaspora communities in Britain maintains connections with South Asia that facilitate trade, investment, educational exchanges, and diplomatic relationships that might otherwise be weaker, absent such human connections. The African diaspora in Britain similarly creates networks connecting Britain with African countries in ways that facilitate various forms of exchange and cooperation. The role of diaspora communities in promoting trade between Britain and origin countries through information sharing about opportunities, reduction of transaction costs through ethnic networks, providing trust and enforcement mechanisms unavailable through formal institutions, and through identification of market opportunities that outsiders might miss, has been documented through research showing higher levels of trade between countries with significant diaspora connections. The soft power benefits, whereby Britain's diversity and its inclusion of citizens from around the world enhances Britain's international image and its appeal as a destination for international students, tourists, and investors, represents another dimension of immigration's international effects that purely domestic analyses miss. The counter-argument that immigration's effects on British foreign policy through diaspora lobbying and through public opinion, effects that make Britain less willing to pursue policies potentially offensive to particular diaspora communities, represents a cost of immigration's international dimensions, requires balancing against these benefits. The educational integration of immigrant children required substantial institutional adaptation, as schools confronted challenges including language barriers for children arriving without English proficiency, cultural differences affecting parental engagement with schools, and understanding of educational expectations, and concentration of immigrant children in particular schools, creating de facto segregation that sometimes undermined educational quality. The provision of English as an additional language support within schools absorbed significant resources while proving essential for enabling immigrant children to access the curriculum and participate in classroom activities. The variation in how effectively different schools and local authorities managed linguistic diversity, with some developing sophisticated approaches, including bilingual support and targeted interventions, while others struggled with inadequate resources and expertise, affected educational outcomes for immigrant children and generated inequality in access to quality education. The housing market impacts of immigration affected both the immigrant population seeking accommodation and established residents concerned about effects on housing costs and availability. The increased demand for housing generated by immigration, adding to pressure on housing stock in areas where housing construction failed to keep pace with population growth, contributed to rising house prices and rents, particularly in London and southeast England, where immigration concentrated most heavily. The concentration of multiple immigrant families in individual properties, sometimes in conditions of severe overcrowding, as immigrants economized on housing costs, generated concerns about housing quality and about effects on neighborhood character. The expansion of private renting sector, partly in response to immigrant demand, as immigrants often unable to access social housing due to eligibility restrictions and unable to purchase property due to financial constraints or immigration status. Uncertainty relied on private landlords, transformed housing tenure patterns, and generated growth of buy-to-let property investment. The argument that immigrants' higher propensity to accept overcrowded and substandard housing enabled exploitative landlord practices and depressed overall housing standards competed with arguments that immigrants' housing, consumption adapted rationally to their economic circumstances and preferences. The role of housing in enabling or constraining immigrant social mobility through effects on wealth accumulation, residential stability, supporting children's education, and access to employment opportunities affected long-term integration trajectories in ways that housing policy interventions might have ameliorated. The labor market integration of immigrants revealed persistent patterns of occupational segregation, whereby immigrants concentrated in particular occupations and industries, often characterized by lower pay, poorer working conditions, and limited advancement prospects compared to occupations where native-born workers predominated. The overrepresentation of immigrants in social care work, hospitality, food processing, agriculture, and cleaning services reflected both immigrants' limited alternatives given language barriers, non-recognition of foreign qualifications, and discrimination, excluding them from better opportunities, and employers' preferences for immigrant workers perceived as more willing to accept low wages, unsociable hours, and physically demanding conditions than native-born workers. The healthcare sector's dependence on immigrant workers, with the National Health Service recruiting substantial numbers of doctors, nurses, and other health professionals from overseas since its inception in 1948, created immigration policy dilemmas as governments attempted to reduce overall immigration while maintaining access to healthcare workers whose skills Britain's educational system failed to produce in sufficient numbers. The ethical concerns about recruiting healthcare workers from developing countries that had invested in training these professionals and that themselves faced healthcare worker shortages generated debate about whether wealthy countries should restrict recruitment from particular countries, and whether compensation mechanisms, including financial transfers to training countries, might address ethical problems. The experience of overseas trained healthcare workers in Britain revealed patterns of discrimination and undervaluation, as foreign qualifications were sometimes viewed with skepticism. Foreign trained professionals faced barriers to career advancement, and racist attitudes from some colleagues and patients created hostile working environments. The contributions of healthcare workers from EU member states, particularly significant numbers of nurses from countries including Portugal, Spain, and Poland, created vulnerabilities as Brexit threatened to end free movement and reduce attractiveness of Britain as a destination, generating concerns about maintaining adequate healthcare staffing levels. The representation of immigration in British media, particularly in tabloid newspapers, whose coverage emphasized crime, welfare, abuse, and cultural threats associated with immigration, while downplaying immigrants' contributions and humanity, significantly influenced public opinion and political discourse. The frequency of stories featuring immigration in negative contexts, the use of dehumanizing language, including references to swarms, floods, and invasions to describe immigrant arrivals, and the selection of atypical cases, presenting immigration in the worst possible light, contributed to public anxieties, disproportionate to immigration's actual impacts. The scholarly research, documenting systematic bias in immigration coverage toward negative framing and toward emphasizing problems rather than benefits, created among media researchers broad consensus that media representation contributed to public hostility toward immigration, independent of people's actual experiences with immigrants. The arguments that media coverage reflected, rather than created public concerns, that media outlets responded to audience preferences, rather than manipulating opinion, and that critique of immigration coverage reflected metropolitan liberal bias, favoring immigration against working-class concerns, represent counter-arguments defending media treatment. The role of social media in amplifying both anti-immigration content through sharing and commenting that increased reach of negative messages, and pro-immigration advocacy through campaigns and organizing that mobilize support for immigrants created new information dynamics where traditional media gatekeeping functions diminished, while online echo chambers potentially increased polarization. The question of whether Britain's history as an imperial power created special obligations toward immigrants from former colonies generated arguments that Commonwealth immigration should be viewed as post-colonial consequence of British imperial extraction of resources and exploitation of colonized populations. The argument that Britain's wealth derived substantially from colonial exploitation, and that therefore Britain owed debts to former colonies, including accepting immigration from these territories, provided moral justification for Commonwealth immigration that purely economic or humanitarian arguments did not encompass. The counter-argument that contemporary British citizens bore no responsibility for historical imperial actions, and that immigration policy should be based on current interests and capacity rather than on historical grievances, reflected rejection of post-colonial guilt arguments. The distinction between admitting that imperial history created connections and obligations versus arguing that such obligations required accepting unlimited immigration from former colonies without regard to British interests or capacity, reflected different positions on how to balance historical responsibility with contemporary concerns. The role of imperial nostalgia and continuing identification with Commonwealth connections in shaping some British attitudes toward Commonwealth immigration, viewing such immigration as maintaining family ties with former colonies, competed with views that immigration from Commonwealth countries represented threats to British identity precisely because such immigration was changing Britain's ethnic and cultural composition. The comparative perspective, examining Britain's immigration experience alongside other European countries, reveals both commonalities in challenges facing all Western European nations, managing immigration and integration, distinctive features of British experience, reflecting particular historical, institutional, and political contexts. The comparison with France's more assimilationist republican model, emphasizing citizenship and secular public sphere, versus Britain's multiculturalist approach, tolerating and even celebrating ethnic and religious diversity, highlights different philosophical approaches to managing ethnic pluralism. The comparison with Germany's historical reliance on temporary guest worker programs, followed by gradual recognition that immigration had become permanent and required integration policies, demonstrates different trajectories reaching similar contemporary challenges. The comparison with Scandinavian countries combining generous welfare states with increasing concerns about immigration's fiscal costs and cultural impacts reveals tensions between social democratic commitments to equality, solidarity, and anxieties that ethnic diversity undermines social trust necessary for welfare state political support. The common challenges across European countries, including aging populations requiring immigrant labor to maintain economic growth and support welfare systems, asylum obligations under international law, creating immigration flows resistant to political control, and populist political mobilization against immigration, generating electoral pressures on mainstream parties, suggests that Britain's immigration debates reflected broader European patterns rather than uniquely British circumstances. The environmental and demographic implications of immigration in contributing to Britain's population growth raise questions about sustainability and about Britain's capacity to accommodate continued population increase in an already densely populated island with limited space and resources. The projection that Britain's population could exceed 70 million by the mid-21st century, with immigration the primary driver of growth given below replacement fertility among native-born population, generated concerns about environmental impacts including loss of green space to development, increased pressure on natural resources, and carbon emissions from larger population. The counter-argument that population growth through immigration contributed less to environmental problems than consumption patterns, and that immigrants tended to have lower per capita environmental footprints than wealthy, native-born British citizens, challenged narratives emphasizing population growth as primary environmental threat. The question of whether Britain's relatively high population density, compared to some European countries but lower density than countries like Netherlands, meant Britain had reached practical limits on population, or whether more intensive land use and better urban planning could accommodate further growth, reflected different assessments of capacity and different priorities regarding quality of life versus continued growth. The technological changes transforming labor markets, including automation, artificial intelligence, and digital platforms, creating gig economy work, affected immigration's role in British labor markets by potentially reducing demand for some types of labor where immigrants concentrated while creating new categories of work where immigration might fill emerging gaps. The speculation that automation would eliminate many low-skilled jobs currently performed by immigrants suggested that future immigration policy might need to focus even more exclusively on high-skilled workers, whose capabilities complemented rather than competed with advancing technology. The counter-argument that demographic change, including aging populations, would sustain demand for care workers, health services, and personal services resistant to automation suggested continuing labor market need for immigration across skill levels. The emergence of global talent competition for highly skilled workers in technology, science, and other advanced fields created pressures for Britain to develop attractive immigration policies for such workers who had alternatives in many countries competing to attract them, suggesting that restrictive immigration policies might undermine Britain's capacity to compete for globally mobile talent. The impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on immigration included temporary sharp reductions in immigration during lockdown periods when international travel virtually ceased, followed by recovery as restrictions eased, but with altered patterns reflecting changed circumstances, including increased remote work possibilities, reducing need for immigration in some sectors. The recognition during pandemic lockdowns of essential workers whose labor sustained critical services, with immigrants prominently represented among healthcare workers, delivery drivers, food processing workers, and others whose work could not be performed remotely, generated public appreciation that complicated anti-immigration narratives, emphasizing burdens rather than contributions. The post-pandemic labor shortages across multiple sectors, including hospitality, transportation, and food production, partly resulting from reduced EU immigration following Brexit and pandemic-related disruptions, created pressures to expand immigration, despite political commitments to reduction. The evolution of remote work, creating possibilities for some workers to perform jobs for British employers while residing elsewhere, challenged traditional immigration frameworks based on physical presence, and raised questions about how to regulate such arrangements and whether remote workers should be counted as immigrants. The question of return migration and circular migration patterns whereby some immigrants eventually returned to origin countries, while others moved between Britain and homelands in repeated cycles, rather than settling permanently, complicated assessments of immigration's impacts and integration trajectories. The substantial return migration from Britain, particularly among EU citizens following Brexit, reduced the EU-born population and altered ethnic demographic trajectories that earlier projections based on permanent settlement had anticipated. The factors influencing return migration decisions, including economic opportunities in origin countries, family considerations, retirement preferences, and experiences of discrimination or disappointed expectations in Britain, affected which immigrants returned, and therefore affected the composition of remaining immigrant population. The phenomenon of return migration among children and young adults brought to Britain by immigrant parents, but who subsequently moved to parents' origin countries for education, employment, or personal reasons, demonstrated that migration did not always proceed in single direction from origin to destination country. The possibilities created by modern transport and communications for maintaining homes and families in multiple countries simultaneously challenged traditional concepts of immigration as permanent transfer of residence from one country to another. The future trajectories of immigration to Britain depend on multiple factors, including economic conditions in Britain and potential origin countries, global political and security situations, generating refugee flows, climate change, potentially displacing populations from vulnerable regions, demographic changes, including aging populations affecting labor demand, and political decisions about immigration policy that reflect domestic politics shaped by public opinion and electoral calculations. The prospect that climate change will generate increasing refugee flows from regions rendered uninhabitable by rising sea levels, drought, extreme weather, and other environmental catastrophes creates moral questions about obligations to climate refugees and practical questions about capacity to accommodate potentially enormous population movements. The aging of Britain's population creating dependency ratios where smaller working-age cohorts must support larger elderly populations suggests continued economic pressure for immigration to maintain labour force size and tax revenues. though technological change and productivity improvements might reduce such pressures. The political sustainability of current immigration levels, or potential expansions, depends on public acceptance that requires addressing concerns about integration, managing pace of demographic change, ensuring adequate public investment in services and infrastructure affected by population growth, and developing narratives about immigration, emphasizing benefits alongside acknowledging challenges. The historical perspective, showing that immigration has been constant throughout English history, that concerns about each new wave of immigrants largely dissipated as immigrants and their descendants integrated into British society, and that immigration repeatedly enriched British economy and culture, suggests reasons for optimism about Britain's capacity to manage immigration effectively, while acknowledging that past success does not guarantee future outcomes. Given potentially unprecedented scale and pace of demographic change, the legacy of immigration in shaping contemporary England manifests in every dimension of British life, from the diversity visible on streets of major cities, through the international character of British culture and cuisine, to the complex ethnic composition reflected in census data, and to the political debates dominating electoral campaigns and parliamentary proceedings. The transformation from the relatively homogeneous society of the immediate post-war years to the ethnic plurality of early 21st century England occurred within living memory for older British citizens, whose lifetimes spanned this dramatic change, creating generational differences in how immigration is perceived with those who experienced earlier ethnically homogeneous Britain, often viewing change more skeptically than younger generations who have known only diverse Britain. The irreversibility of demographic transformation, given that second and third generation immigrants are British citizens by birth, and that future demographic trends reflect primarily differential birth rates between ethnic groups, rather than continued large-scale immigration, suggests that debates about immigration's desirability must give way to questions about managing diversity and promoting integration of already present ethnic minority populations. The implementation of the post-Brexit immigration system from January 2021 required extensive adjustments by employers, educational institutions, and government agencies as familiar arrangements governing EU citizen movements ceased, and new bureaucratic procedures came into force across all sectors dependent on international labour mobility. The health and care worker visa route, introduced to facilitate recruitment of healthcare professionals while addressing acute shortages exposed by the pandemic, removed the immigration skills charge and reduced application fees for health sector workers, demonstrating government recognition that ideological commitments to reducing immigration could not override practical necessity of maintaining healthcare staffing levels. The expansion of this route to include care workers in 2021, reversing earlier resistance to classifying care work as skilled employment, warranting visa sponsorship, reflected both lobbying by the care sector and acceptance that Britain's ageing population required substantial care workforce that domestic recruitment could not supply. The subsequent concerns about exploitation of care workers recruited from overseas, including workers arriving with substantial debts to recruitment agencies and facing poor pay and conditions, while unable to change employers easily due to visa restrictions, tying them to sponsoring employers, revealed how immigration policy intersected with labour market regulation and worker protection in ways that required coordinated policy responses across multiple domains. The Nationality and Borders Act of 2022, representing the most significant reform of asylum and immigration law in decades, attempted to address irregular immigration through measures including offshore processing of asylum claims, expanded grounds for inadmissibility of asylum applications, and increased penalties for illegal entry designed to deter channel crossings in small boats. The controversial proposal to process asylum seekers in Rwanda, with those arriving irregularly in Britain, to be sent to Rwanda for processing and potential settlement there, rather than in Britain, generated intense legal challenges based on arguments that Rwanda could not be considered a safe third country for asylum processing, and that the policy violated international refugee law obligations. The legal proceedings through British courts, and eventually to the Supreme Court, which ruled in November 2023 that the Rwanda scheme would be unlawful because of risks that asylum seekers sent to Rwanda might subsequently be returned to countries where they faced persecution, demonstrated limits on executive authority to reshape asylum policy when such policies conflicted with legal obligations and human rights protections. The government's response through emergency legislation, declaring Rwanda safe and attempting to override judicial concerns, reflected determination to implement deterrent policies despite legal obstacles, generating constitutional tensions about separation of powers and about whether Parliament could legitimately instruct courts to ignore evidence about actual conditions in Rwanda. The graduate route introduced in July 2021, permitting international students who completed degrees at British universities to remain for 2 years after graduation to seek employment without requiring employer sponsorship, represented an attempt to enhance Britain's attractiveness as a study destination and to facilitate retention of internationally trained talent. The rapid increase in international student numbers following introduction of this route, with India surpassing China as the largest source country for international students by 2023, reflected both the route's attractiveness and changing global patterns in international education. The subsequent political concerns about whether international students were using study visas primarily as immigration routes rather than for genuine educational purposes, evidenced by concentration of students in particular institutions and courses that critics characterized as low quality, generated proposals to restrict international student numbers or to limit access to post-study work rights. The tension between education sector interests in maintaining international student revenue that subsidized domestic teaching and research and immigration control objectives seeking to reduce overall immigration numbers created policy conflicts that different government departments approached from incompatible perspectives. The Hong Kong British National Overseas Visa Scheme, introduced in January 2021, following China's imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong, created a unique immigration pathway reflecting Britain's historical relationship with Hong Kong and contemporary geopolitical positioning regarding China. The eligibility criteria permitting British national overseas passport holders and their dependents to settle in Britain and apply for citizenship after 6 years generated estimates that potentially over 5 million Hong Kong residents held theoretical eligibility, though actual take-up would likely involve much smaller numbers. The arrivals under this scheme, through 2023, approaching 150,000 people, exceeded initial projections, while remaining well below potential maximum, reflecting both push factors in Hong Kong, including political repression and deteriorating freedoms, and pull factors, including Britain's relatively accessible pathway to settlement and citizenship. The settlement patterns of Hong Kong arrivals concentrated particularly in prosperous areas of southern England, but also including significant numbers in Manchester, Birmingham, and other cities where housing costs were lower than in London and South East, demonstrated how economic considerations influenced residential choices, even among relatively prosperous immigrant groups. The establishment of Hong Kong community organizations, schools providing Cantonese language instruction, and businesses serving Hong Kong immigrant populations created visible community presence that facilitated integration while maintaining cultural connections to Hong Kong. The expansion of the Homes for Ukraine scheme in March 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, represented Britain's largest refugee response in decades, permitting unlimited numbers of Ukrainians with British sponsors to receive temporary protection in Britain. The reliance on private sponsors to provide accommodation, rather than government provision through dispersal to local authority areas, marked a departure from previous refugee resettlement approaches and reflected both practical considerations about government capacity and ideological preferences for private humanitarian responses. The rapid sign-up of approximately 200,000 British households offering to host Ukrainian refugees demonstrated public sympathy for Ukraine and willingness to contribute practically to humanitarian response, though subsequent challenges, including relationship breakdowns between hosts and guests, inadequate safeguarding procedures that enabled some exploitative or abusive situations, and insufficient support for sponsors managing difficulties generated concerns about sustainability of the sponsor-based model. The arrivals of approximately 160,000 Ukrainians by late 2023 created substantial Ukrainian communities, particularly in areas where sponsor availability was highest, typically more prosperous regions, with larger homes and more resources to support refugees. The labor market integration of Ukrainian refugees proceeded variably, with some highly skilled professionals struggling to have qualifications recognized or to access employment matching their skills, while others found work quickly in sectors experiencing labor shortages, and with single mothers who constituted substantial portions of arrivals facing childcare constraints, limiting employment possibilities. The skilled worker visa route that replaced the Tier 2 system from 2021 implemented the points-based framework that government rhetoric had emphasized as providing control and selectivity, requiring sponsorship by approved employers, and meeting salary thresholds that varied by occupation, based on going rates for particular jobs. The expansion of the shortage occupation list, identifying jobs where insufficient British worker supply warranted reduced salary thresholds and easier recruitment of overseas workers, demonstrated continuing employer demand for immigrant workers across numerous sectors, despite political rhetoric about reducing immigration. The care worker shortage that prompted inclusion of care work on the shortage occupation list generated rapid increase in care worker visa issuance, bringing substantial numbers of workers from India, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and other countries to fill vacancies in residential and domiciliary care. The subsequent removal of care workers' right to bring dependents in March 2024, responding to concerns that care worker visa route was generating substantial derivative immigration of family members who themselves might require public services, reflected government attempts to reduce overall immigration numbers by restricting secondary migration, even while accepting continued need for primary care worker immigration. The oscillation in policy between addressing labour market needs through expanded immigration routes and responding to political pressures to reduce immigration numbers by imposing new restrictions demonstrated continuing tensions between economic and political imperatives in immigration policy formation. The Albanian asylum seeker arrivals that became politically prominent during 2022, with Albanians constituting the single largest nationality arriving via Channel small boat crossings, generated particular controversy about distinction between economic migrants and genuine refugees. The characterization by some politicians and media outlets of Albanian arrivals as primarily young men seeking economic opportunities rather than fleeing persecution, complicated by evidence that some Albanian arrivals did face genuine threats, including from organized crime groups or due to political opposition or blood feuds, demonstrated difficulties in categorical distinctions between refugee and economic migrant that individual circumstances often blurred. The Albanian government's cooperation with British authorities on returns of failed asylum seekers, enabled by expedited processing and removal procedures, resulted in substantial reduction in Albanian arrivals by 2023, as potential migrants received clear signals that Albanian asylum claims faced low success rates and quick removal. The success in reducing Albanian arrivals through combination of fast processing, high rejection rates, and effective returns demonstrated that when political will existed and origin country cooperation could be secured, irregular immigration from particular source countries could be substantially reduced, though such approaches required circumstances including origin country stability and cooperation that did not exist for many asylum seeker source countries. The integration outcomes for different immigrant and ethnic minority groups, measured through indicators including employment rates, earnings, educational attainment, home ownership, and subjective measures of belonging and discrimination experiences, revealed persistent disparities alongside evidence of advancement across generations. The generally strong labour market performance of Indian, Chinese, and white immigrant groups contrasted with weaker employment and earnings outcomes for Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Black African, and Black Caribbean groups, reflecting both human capital differences, including educational credentials and English language proficiency, and discrimination effects that numerous audit studies and controlled experiments consistently documented. The residential mobility patterns showing gradual dispersal of ethnic minority populations from initial settlement areas towards suburbs and smaller towns, as economic advancement enabled movement to more desirable residential areas, suggested integration processes operating alongside persistence of ethnic clustering and emergence of new ethnic concentration areas. The growth of ethnic minority populations in prosperous suburban areas and market towns, creating what scholars termed ethnic minority middle-class suburbs, demonstrated that residential concentration did not simply reflect poverty and constraint, but also resulted from preferences for residential proximity to co-ethnics, even among those with resources to live elsewhere. The counter-urbanization of some ethnic minority groups with second-generation members moving from London and other major cities to smaller towns and rural areas reversed the urbanization pattern of initial immigrant settlement and created ethnic diversity in areas previously almost entirely white, generating both enrichment through diversity and tensions as long-established residents confronted demographic changes. The complexity of segregation patterns whereby increasing ethnic diversity at the national level coexisted with continuing or even increasing residential separation between ethnic groups at neighborhood level demonstrated that aggregate diversity statistics could mask local segregation that shaped daily experiences and opportunities. The role of faith institutions in maintaining ethnic community cohesion and in facilitating or complicating integration revealed tensions between religious community functions, providing support and identity for immigrants and their descendants, and concerns about parallel communities insufficiently connected to broader British society. The growth of mosques, temples, gurdwaras, and churches serving particular ethnic communities beyond simply religious functions, to include social services, youth programs, elderly care, and community organizing, demonstrated institutional density that reflected community maturity and organizational capacity, while potentially reducing participation in mainstream British institutions. The intra-religious diversity within broad categories like British Muslims, encompassing vast differences between Sunni and Shia, between different schools of Islamic jurisprudence, between ethnic groups including Arabs, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Somalis, and numerous others, and between varying levels of religious observance and interpretation, cautioned against treating religious categories as homogeneous communities with unified perspectives and interests. The emergence of second and third generation religious leadership, born and educated in Britain, replacing immigrant origin religious leaders whose training in origin countries and limited English proficiency sometimes created disconnects with British-born youth, gradually transformed religious institutions toward greater engagement with British context, while maintaining religious authenticity and connections to traditional teachings. The economic contributions of immigrant entrepreneurs establishing businesses that created employment, filled market niches, and contributed to economic vitality, particularly in declining urban areas, demonstrated immigration's role in urban regeneration and economic innovation. The prominence of immigrant entrepreneurs, in particular sectors including restaurants, convenience, retail, construction, and increasingly technology and professional services, reflected both blocked opportunities in mainstream employment, encouraging self-employment as alternative advancement route, and cultural capital, including business experience, risk tolerance, and family labor availability that facilitated entrepreneurship. The South Asian domination of the convenience retail sector, with studies estimating that ethnic minority ownership exceeded 50% of independent convenience stores by the early 21st century, exemplified how particular ethnic groups developed specialization in particular economic niches through combination of initial entry by pioneers, transfer of business knowledge within ethnic networks, and access to co-ethnic labor and financing. The success of immigrant entrepreneurs in revitalizing declining high streets where British retailers had withdrawn, providing essential services in underserved areas, and creating employment both for co-ethnics and for native-born workers, contradicted narratives, emphasizing only costs and problems associated with immigration, while demonstrating how immigrant economic activity could benefit broader communities. The digital economy's growth and the rise of platform-based work, including delivery services, ride-sharing, and other gig economy sectors, attracted substantial immigrant participation, with immigrants disproportionately represented among food delivery couriers, Uber drivers, and other platform workers. The flexibility of platform work that permitted workers to choose hours and that required minimal English proficiency or formal qualifications made such work accessible to recent immigrants, while the precarious nature of such employment, including lack of employment protections, irregular income, and absence of benefits, created vulnerabilities and economic insecurity. The concentration of particular immigrant groups, including Latin Americans, Eastern Europeans, and South Asians, in delivery work for companies like Deliveroo, Uber Eats, and others transformed urban service delivery, while raising questions about whether such work represented integration into British labour markets or exploitation of immigrant workers in precarious employment relationships. The legal ambiguity about employment status of platform workers, with companies classifying workers as self-employed independent contractors while exercising substantial control over working conditions, generated litigation and regulatory debates about whether platform workers deserved employment rights and protections, with outcomes affecting immigrant platform workers, particularly significantly given their concentration in such work. The question of how immigration affected innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic dynamism in Britain through channels beyond simple labour supply. Effects received increasing attention from economists seeking to measure immigration's full economic impacts. The research showing disproportionate immigrant representation among patent holders, founders of high-growth technology companies, and recipients of research grants suggested that high-skilled immigration contributed to innovation and productivity growth beyond immigrants' direct labour force participation. The mechanisms through which immigration promoted innovation, including diverse perspectives, improving problem-solving, international networks facilitating knowledge transfer, and selection effects, whereby immigrants willing to undertake migration challenges possessed characteristics, including risk tolerance and ambition that correlated with innovative activity, operated through complex channels, difficult to quantify precisely, but plausibly substantial. The counter-argument that any innovation and entrepreneurship benefits from immigration must be weighed against potential costs, including brain drain from origin countries, displacement of native entrepreneurship and innovation if immigrants crowded out rather than complemented native activity, and fiscal costs of supporting unsuccessful immigrant entrepreneurs and their families, suggested that net innovation effects remained ambiguous even if gross contributions appeared impressive. The criminological research examining immigrant involvement in criminal activity as offenders and as victims revealed complex patterns contradicting simplistic narratives about immigration, driving crime increases. The statistical evidence from official crime records and victimization surveys generally showing that first-generation immigrants had lower crime rates than native-born populations of similar demographic characteristics, particularly when accounting for age and gender composition, that skewed immigrant populations toward young males with highest general crime propensity, challenged common perception that immigration increased crime. The variation across immigrant groups, with some showing substantially lower crime rates than natives, while others approached or exceeded native rates, reflecting both different characteristics of immigrant populations and different experiences in British labour markets and society, cautioned against generalisations about immigrant criminality. The concentration of some immigrant groups in particular offence types, including immigration-related crimes, by definition only committable by immigrants, certain fraud offences, where international networks enabled schemes difficult for natives alone, and conversely underrepresentation in other crime types, created offence-specific patterns more complex than aggregate crime rate comparisons captured. The vulnerability of immigrants to criminal victimization, including exploitation by employers, housing abuse by landlords, domestic violence in situations where immigration status, dependence on abusive sponsors, complicated escape, and hate crimes targeting visible ethnic minorities, demonstrated that immigration's relationship to crime included immigrants as victims of crimes that inadequate protections and enforcement sometimes failed to prevent or punish. The impact of Brexit on UK-EU migration patterns included not only expected reductions in EU immigration as free movement ended and new visa requirements imposed costs and bureaucratic burdens, but also substantial emigration of EU citizens resident in Britain who chose to leave after Brexit. The decline in EU-born population resident in Britain, from estimated 3.7 million in 2019 to approximately 3.5 million by 2021, representing loss of approximately 200,000 EU-born residents, reflected return migration to origin countries, onward migration to other destinations, and reduced willingness of EU citizens to settle in Britain given post-Brexit uncertainty and reduced welcome. The sectoral impacts of reduced EU labour supply manifested acutely in hospitality, food processing, logistics, and agriculture, where EU workers had predominated, with employers reporting severe recruitment difficulties and, in some cases, business constraints, including reduced opening hours, service reductions, or production limits due to insufficient staffing. The wage increases in some affected sectors, as employers competed for scarcer workers, demonstrated labour market adjustment processes that standard economic theory predicted, though questions remained about whether such wage increases would be sustained, whether they reflected genuine productivity increases, justifying higher wages, and whether increased labour costs would generate inflationary pressures or business closures, rather than simply transferring surplus from employers to workers. The development of integration policy beyond simple provision of initial settlement services toward longer-term programs, supporting language acquisition, credential recognition, civic participation, and community cohesion, reflected evolution in understanding of integration as long-term process, requiring sustained support, rather than simply leaving immigrants to sink or swim. The English for Speakers of Other Languages, ESOL, provision that offered publicly funded English language instruction to immigrants and refugees, faced persistent funding challenges as demand exceeded available places, leaving many immigrants on waiting lists for months or years, and thereby impeding labour market access and social integration that required English proficiency. The credential recognition challenges facing professionally qualified immigrants whose origin country qualifications were not automatically recognised in Britain, requiring expensive and time-consuming assessment and often substantial additional training, created barriers to utilising immigrant human capital while generating frustration among immigrants whose professional identities and career expectations could not be fulfilled. The citizenship acquisition process, requiring applicants to pass the Life in the UK test, demonstrating knowledge of British history, culture, and institutions, and to meet English language requirements, created barriers, particularly for older immigrants and those with limited education, generating debates about whether such requirements appropriately emphasized civic knowledge and linguistic integration, or unnecessarily excluded immigrants willing and able to contribute to British society, despite limited formal knowledge, tested by examinations. The concept of British values that gained prominence in integration policy discourse, particularly following the 2005 London bombings, typically articulated as including democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, and tolerance, generated debates about whether such values were distinctively British or rather universal liberal values, whether emphasizing British values represented inclusive civic nationalism or exclusionary ethnic nationalism, when deployed to suggest immigrant cultures were incompatible with British society, and whether values-based integration requirements could effectively promote integration or merely imposed ideological tests irrelevant to actual integration processes. The requirement that schools promote fundamental British values, that citizenship applicants demonstrate commitment to such values, and that organisations receiving government funding support British values, created implementation challenges about how abstract values translated into specific behaviours and attitudes, and about whether imposing values from above could generate genuine integration or merely conformity and resentment. The criticism that British values discourse unfairly targeted Muslim communities, with implicit suggestion that Islamic values conflicted with British values, despite many Muslims arguing that their Islamic faith was perfectly compatible with values like democracy and tolerance, and that emphasizing religious difference undermined rather than supported integration, revealed tensions in values-based approach to integration policy. The growth of anti-immigration activism and far-right mobilization, including groups like Britain First, the English Defence League, and more recent formations organize protests, online campaigns, and in some cases, violence targeting immigrants, Muslims, and ethnic minorities. The motivations for participation in anti-immigration movements varied from ideological commitment to white nationalism and explicit racism through cultural anxieties about neighborhood change and erosion of traditional British culture to economic concerns about job competition and wage effects, with research suggesting most participants combined multiple motivations rather than fitting simple categories. The relationship between mainstream political rhetoric about immigration, particularly from right-wing politicians and media outlets, and far-right mobilization remained contested, with some arguing that inflammatory language and negative framing legitimized and encouraged extremist responses, while others argued that mainstream voices responded to genuine public concerns and that conflating legitimate immigration criticism with extremism unfairly stigmatized immigration skepticism. The attacks on immigration and ethnic minority targets, including the murder of Polish man Arkadiusz Jóźwik in 2016 following Brexit referendum, numerous arson attacks on mosques and immigrant-owned businesses, and assaults on visibly ethnic minority individuals, demonstrated that anti-immigration sentiment sometimes generated violence, affecting innocent individuals targeted simply for their ethnic appearance or immigrant status. The counter-mobilization by pro-immigration activists, anti-racist campaigners, and refugee support groups, including organizations like Hope Not Hate, Stand Up to Racism, and numerous local solidarity groups, organized counter-demonstrations, advocacy campaigns, and practical support for immigrants and refugees. The tensions between approaches emphasizing moral arguments about refugee rights and humanitarian obligations versus approaches emphasizing economic benefits and practical contributions from immigration reflected strategic disagreements about most effective messaging to build public support for immigration. The challenge of building broad pro-immigration coalition when potential supporters ranged from radical open borders advocates through liberal supporters of controlled immigration to employers primarily interested in labor supply, ethnic minority communities concerned about specific discriminatory policies created tensions about priorities and tactics. The success of local integration initiatives, bringing together immigrants and established residents through community events, volunteering programs, and cultural exchanges in building personal relationships and reducing prejudice, suggested that abstract debates about immigration policy mattered less for local integration than concrete opportunities for positive intergroup contact, though scaling such local initiatives to achieve broader societal impact proved challenging. The pandemic's exposure of systemic inequalities affecting ethnic minority communities through disproportionate COVID mortality rates, greater economic impacts due to concentration in sectors most affected by lockdowns, overcrowded housing, facilitating disease transmission, and limited access to healthcare, generated renewed attention to structural disadvantages requiring policy responses. The research documenting that Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Black African, and Black Caribbean groups experience COVID death rates approximately double those of white British populations, even after accounting for age, geography, and pre-existing health conditions, suggested that ethnic health inequalities reflected deeper social determinants, including occupational exposures, housing quality, and healthcare access, beyond simply individual behaviors or biological factors. The concentration of ethnic minority workers in key worker roles including healthcare, transport, retail, and delivery services that required continued workplace attendance during lockdowns, when office workers shifted to remote work, exposed ethnic minority workers to greater infection risks while providing essential services, sustaining society through the pandemic. The recognition of such contributions, alongside acknowledgement of disproportionate harms, generated commitments to addressing ethnic inequalities, though translating such commitments into concrete policy changes and resource allocation adequate to reduce inequalities proved challenging, as other priorities competed for attention and resources in pandemic recovery period. The question of how to measure integration and assess its progress or failure across different immigrant groups and across time proved methodologically challenging given disputes about what integration should encompass and how various dimensions should be weighted. The development of integration indicators by researchers and policy organizations, including measures of employment, earnings, educational attainment, language proficiency, residential segregation, intermarriage rates, civic participation, identity and belonging, and discrimination experiences created multidimensional frameworks recognizing that integration encompassed multiple domains where progress might vary independently. The intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage within immigrant families, determining the extent to which parental characteristics and circumstances constrained or enabled children's opportunities, shaped second and third generation outcomes and trajectories. The research on educational mobility, showing that some ethnic minority groups, including Indians and Chinese, experience strong upward mobility, with second generation achieving substantially higher educational levels than their immigrant parents, while other groups, including Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups, showed more limited educational mobility, reflected both parental human capital and community resources, supporting educational achievement, and structural barriers, including school quality and discrimination affecting opportunities. The local governance challenges, created by rapid immigration-driven demographic change, in particular areas, required developing responsive local policies, managing pressures on services, housing, and social cohesion, while avoiding scapegoating immigrants for problems rooted in inadequate central government funding and support. The Migration Impacts Fund, established in 2008 to provide additional resources to local authorities experiencing rapid immigration-driven population growth, and subsequently abolished in 2010 during MNX. Austerity budgets exemplified tensions between recognition that immigration could create local pressures requiring additional resources and fiscal constraints limiting government willingness to provide such resources. The variation across local authorities in how effectively they managed immigration integration, with some developing proactive strategies, including language support, community engagement, and service adaptation, while others struggled with inadequate capacity and expertise, reflected both resources differences and variations in political will and community leadership. The creation of local integration partnerships, bringing together local government, voluntary organizations, immigrant communities, and other stakeholders to coordinate integration activities and share resources, demonstrated potential for collaborative approaches, though sustainability of such partnerships often proved challenging when dependent on time-limited funding or vulnerable to shifts in political priorities. The role of voluntary and community organizations in providing services to immigrants, including advice on immigration status, housing assistance, employment support, English language classes, and cultural programs exceeded what government services provided, while creating dependencies on charitable funding and volunteer labor that proved precarious and insufficient to meet needs. The development of immigrant and ethnic minority-led organizations within specific communities brought cultural competence and trust that mainstream organizations sometimes lacked, enabling more effective service delivery and community engagement, while also risking fragmentation of services along ethnic lines and potentially reinforcing separation rather than promoting integration across communities. The challenge of balancing recognition and support for community-specific organizations serving particular ethnic and linguistic groups against goals of social cohesion and cross-community connections reflected broader tensions. In multiculturalism, between respecting difference and promoting commonality, the funding pressures facing voluntary sector organizations, exacerbated by austerity policies, reducing government grants, and competitive contracting processes, favoring larger, established organizations over small community groups, undermined capacity of voluntary sector to support integration at precisely the time when immigration levels and integration needs were highest. The international comparisons examining integration outcomes in Britain relative to other European countries revealed Britain performing moderately well on some indicators, including labour market participation and political representation, while showing more concerning patterns on residential segregation and educational outcomes for particular groups. The comparison with countries like Canada and Australia that operated points-based immigration systems emphasizing human capital selection suggested that such systems produced immigrant populations with better labor market outcomes on fares average than Britain's immigration system that combined family reunion, asylum, and work migration, creating more diverse immigrant population, including some with limited educational credentials and language skills. The climate change implications for future immigration included both potential refugee flows from regions rendered uninhabitable by environmental degradation and opportunities for Britain to address its own climate adaptation needs, including food security through managed immigration enabling agricultural productivity. The projection that climate change would displace hundreds of millions of people globally by the end of the 21st century through sea level rise, desertification, extreme weather, and agricultural collapse created moral questions about obligations to climate refugees, particularly given Britain's contribution to historical emissions causing climate change. The absence of international legal frameworks providing protection to climate refugees who fell outside existing refugee definitions based on persecution rather than environmental factors created policy gaps requiring new international LOCH agreements or national policy innovations to address emerging needs. The political challenges of building support for large-scale climate refugee admission, when domestic publics showed limited enthusiasm for current immigration levels, suggested that climate migration would generate substantial conflicts requiring visionary leadership and international cooperation to manage humanely. The question of whether contemporary immigration patterns were creating permanent ethnic plurality in Britain, with no ethnic majority, or whether current ethnic minority populations would eventually assimilate into expanded white British category as Irish and Jewish immigrants historically did, remained contested and fundamentally speculative. The persistent salience of racial differences, marking some ethnic minorities as visibly other in ways that white immigrant groups historically were not, created skepticism about whether racial minorities could ever be fully incorporated into British identity in ways that eliminated their distinctiveness and disadvantage. The evidence of increasing intermarriage rates, particularly among Caribbean and mixed heritage populations, suggested that ethnic boundaries were permeable and that future generations might identify less strongly with ethnic categories. While continuing high rates of endogamy among South Asian groups, particularly Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, suggested more persistent ethnic separation. The emergence of complex mixed heritage populations, identifying with multiple ethnic categories, and the increasing fluidity of ethnic identity among younger generations, complicated, simple projections about ethnic demographic futures, suggested that ethnic categories themselves were malleable social constructions rather than fixed demographic facts. The technological developments, including artificial intelligence, automation, and remote work capabilities that were transforming labor markets and economic geography, had ambiguous implications for future immigration needs and patterns. The potential for automation to eliminate many routine jobs currently performed by immigrants suggested reduced future labor demand for low-skilled immigration, though demographic aging simultaneously created growing needs for care work and personal services resistant to automation. The expansion of remote work, enabling skilled workers to perform jobs from anywhere, potentially reduced immigration needs if British employers could hire overseas workers who remained in their origin countries, though also created possibilities for Britain to attract remote workers through digital nomad visas or similar schemes offering tax benefits and residency rights to globally mobile skilled workers. The competition among nations to attract global talent in technology, science, and innovation through favorable immigration policies, tax regimes, and quality of life amenities created pressures for Britain to develop attractive immigration offerings for high-skilled workers who had multiple destination options, suggesting that future immigration policy might need to emphasize recruitment incentives rather than simply controlling numbers. The evolution of British national identity in response to immigration and ethnic diversity created tensions between inclusive civic nationalism, defining Britishness through commitment to democratic values and civic participation regardless of ethnic background, and continuing resonance of ethnic and cultural conceptions of Britishness associated with whiteness and Christian heritage. The research examining national identity attitudes across ethnic groups showed that ethnic minorities generally identified strongly as British alongside their ethnic identities, contradicting narratives suggesting minorities rejected British identity, while also revealing that many white British people questioned whether ethnic minorities could truly be British, regardless of citizenship or commitment to British values. The asymmetry whereby ethnic minorities needed to prove their Britishness through displays of patriotism and cultural assimilation, while white British people had their Britishness assumed as natural, reflected racialized conceptions of belonging that integration policies, emphasizing values and citizenship, could not fully overcome. The younger generation attitudes showing stronger acceptance of ethnic diversity and more expansive understanding of who could be British suggested generational change might gradually create more inclusive national identity. Though resurgence of ethno-nationalist politics in Britain and elsewhere demonstrated that such progress was not inevitable or irreversible, the historical perspective reveals that contemporary anxieties about immigration and integration echo concerns expressed in every previous period of significant immigration to England, from Romano-British complaints about Germanic barbarians, through medieval restrictions on foreign merchants, through early modern suspicion of Catholic refugees, through Victorian worries about Jewish immigration, through post-war panic about Commonwealth immigrants. The pattern whereby each new immigrant group initially faced hostility and discrimination, but eventually integrated into British society and came to be viewed as acceptably British, if not quite as British as established populations, provides historical grounds for optimism that current immigrant groups will follow similar trajectories despite contemporary concerns that present circumstances differ fundamentally from past experiences. The recognition that successful historical integration occurred not through immigrants simply assimilating to unchanging British culture, but through mutual transformation, whereby immigrants adapted to British society while also changing it. Through their cultural contributions and through forcing institutional adaptations, suggests that contemporary integration similarly requires bilateral change rather than unilateral immigrant assimilation. The documentation, through this comprehensive historical examination of immigration's persistent role in English demographic, economic, and cultural development across more than 2 millennia, establishes that immigration represents not aberration from English history, but constant feature, whose management has always challenged political authorities, while generally enriching English society, despite periodic social tensions and adjustment costs. The synthesis of archaeological evidence from Romano-British cemeteries revealing ethnic diversity, genetic analysis demonstrating massive population replacements during prehistoric migrations, documentary records tracking medieval merchant movements, parish registers documenting early modern refugee settlements, 19th century census data revealing Irish and Jewish concentrations, 20th century immigration statistics quantifying Commonwealth arrivals, and 21st century administrative data measuring Eastern European immigration creates comprehensive evidence base demonstrating immigration's continuous presence throughout English history. The technological and methodological advances enabling increasingly sophisticated analysis of past populations through isotopic analysis of skeletal remains, revealing geographical origins, ancient DNA analysis, reconstructing population movements, linguistic analysis, tracking language changes, reflecting population contacts, and GIS mapping of historical demographic patterns allows contemporary scholars to understand past immigration with precision, impossible for earlier generations of historians. The interdisciplinary integration of archaeology, genetics, linguistics, history, sociology, and political science in studying immigration demonstrates how complex phenomena requiring multiple analytical approaches and how no single discipline possesses sufficient tools and perspectives to fully comprehend immigration's multifaceted impacts and dynamics. The comparative perspective examining England's immigration history alongside other nations reveals both universal patterns, including initial hostility, followed by gradual integration, economic contributions alongside social tensions, and generational change toward fuller incorporation and distinctive features, including England's particular colonial legacy, creating continuing relationships with former colonies, its geographical position, creating particular migration routes, and its political and institutional structures shaping policy responses. The lesson that successful immigration integration required effective governance, including adequate resources for public services, proactive integration policies, enforcement against discrimination, and political leadership willing to make case for immigration, despite public skepticism, applies across different contexts and time periods. The counter-lesson that immigration, even when ultimately beneficial, could generate significant short-term costs and adjustment challenges, particularly for communities directly experiencing rapid demographic change, and for workers competing with immigrants, in particular labor market segments, cautioned against dismissing public concerns as simply racist or ignorant. The recognition that immigration's long-term impacts operate through complex mechanisms, including demographic effects on population size and age structure, economic effects through labor, supply and demand, fiscal effects through tax contributions and service utilization, social effects on community cohesion and identity, political effects on electoral coalitions and policy priorities, and cultural effects on cuisine, music, language, and customs requires sophisticated analysis, avoiding simplistic generalizations about whether immigration is good or bad. The variation in immigration's impacts across different domains, different time periods, different immigrant groups, and different receiving communities necessitates nuanced understanding, recognizing that immigration simultaneously generates benefits and costs, whose distribution across population and across time creates winners and losers, whose different interests and perspectives legitimately inform debates about immigration policy. The political challenge of crafting immigration policies balancing economic needs for labor mobility, humanitarian obligations to refugees, family reunification rights, maintaining immigrant social integration and well-being, and public concerns about pace of change and integration challenges requires difficult trade-offs, with no policy able to satisfy all stakeholders or advance all objectives simultaneously. The future of immigration to England will reflect global dynamics, including economic development patterns affecting migration pressures from poorer to richer countries, political instability and conflict generating refugee flows, climate change displacing populations, and demographic changes, including aging populations in developed countries, increasing care needs alongside fertility decline, reducing working-age populations. The policy choices Britain makes about immigration numbers, selection criteria, rights and restrictions, and integration support will shape how these global dynamics translate into actual immigration flows and outcomes. The societal responses to continuing diversity, including whether Britain develops more inclusive national identity, embracing ethnic plurality, or experiences nationalist backlash, rejecting diversity, will determine whether immigration enriches British society. As historical experience suggests, it generally has, or generates lasting divisions and conflicts, undermining social cohesion. The investment in integration, including adequate funding for English language instruction, equitable access to education and training, enforcement against discrimination, support for community cohesion, and infrastructure and services meeting needs of growing population will substantially affect integration success, regardless of immigration numbers and selection policies. England's history shows immigration shaping society from Neolithic settlements through Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, medieval trade, religious refugees, industrial labor, post-war Commonwealth flows, to today's diverse nation. Recognizing diversity as a constant challenges the myth of a monocultural past. Successful integration has always required active effort from immigrants, communities, and institutions. Managing immigration effectively demands resources, policy, and political courage, balancing social benefits with integration challenges. England's future diversity depends on collective choices that will determine whether historical patterns of adaptation continue or face unprecedented strains.